Good morning, everyone. Ladies and gentlemen, please take your seats. If you would please put your cell phones on silent or stun, that'll be greatly appreciated. This meeting will be broadcast live and archived, and we are ready to start. Good morning. At this time, I'd like to call today's meeting of the Texas Racing Commission Rules Review Committee to order. The time is 10:01 a.m. Welcome to the third meeting of the Texas Racing Commission's Comprehensive Rules Review. I'm Dr. Connie McNabb, Vice Chair of the Texas Racing Commission and Chair of the Commission's Rules Review Committee. I'm pleased to be joined by our Commission General Counsel, Virginia Fields. The Texas Racing Commissioners present do not constitute a quorum, and that would be me. We do have a distinguished visitor from the Texas Department of Agriculture, Mr. Burgess. Welcome. Thank you very much. We appreciate you coming and your great insight. Government code. The code is to simplify the Texas rules of racing so they give clear direction to regulators, racing participants, and the public. The process will include the opportunity to update the agency procedures through both internal and external work group meetings to collaborate and to recommend approval of updated policies and procedures to the Commission, thereby improving the integrity of racing, the agency's responsiveness to the industry, and at the same time becoming a transparent and accountable organization. We are here at Lone Star Race Park, currently engaged in the quarter horse meet, and to listen to the concerns and comments of the racing participants, licensees, and constituents here participating in the great sport of horse racing. Over the next 18 months, this committee will hold additional meetings throughout the state in the communities that thrive and contribute to horse racing. Today, we are pleased to begin with the new Chapter 304. This chapter combines the current rules of racing, Chapter 309 and 311, on racetrack and occupational licensing. We will also begin the session today with additional public comment on the new Chapter 302, which combines the current Chapters 301 and 303. We plan to end today's public forum with a discussion of the next rules, Chapter 306, which will cover health and safety. Chapters 304 and 306 have a public meeting for full discussion in January of 2023 at a date and place to be determined. We are happy to have Mindy Coleman with the Jockeys Guild present today via Zoom to provide us with recommendations and proposals relating to jockey health and safety, and appreciate her devoting the time to be with us. Virginia, do you have any comments before we call on other participants wishing to make public comments and presentations?
No, but welcome everybody. I do want to say a big thank you to Lone Star Park for allowing us to come and participate here at this forum today. They've been extremely helpful, as you can all tell. They've set us up quite well for the technology to have Mindy here, who was tied up with the Breeders' Cup and couldn't get here physically. So they made it available via Zoom for Mindy to attend. I also want everyone to feel free to sign the public comment cards. Vanessa over here to my right have public comment cards, as well as a copy of the agenda and the meeting materials for today if you do not have them available via your phone from the website. And thank you, Commissioner.
Thank you very much, Virginia. Invited testimony. We will now move on to agenda item 2, invited testimony from Mindy Coleman with the Jockeys Guild, appearing by Zoom. Mindy, take it away, and thank you for being here.
Good morning. Thank you. Good morning, commissioners and committee members. I greatly appreciate you giving the Guild the opportunity to speak on these most important items of safety, not only for the jockeys, but the equine athletes as well. As the Guild has long stated, the health and welfare of both the equine and human athletes is paramount and should always be of the utmost precedence in our industry. While we recognize there are inherent risks associated with horse racing, we as an industry have an obligation to assure that it's being conducted in the safest manner possible. It's the jockeys' lives and the well-being that are obviously at risk when there's risk to the horses. We have long been a proponent of creating and establishing uniform regulations in our industry in hopes of creating the safest racing environment for all of the participants. Because of that, we have, throughout the past several years, the Guild has been supportive in concepts and ideas that have been introduced by various organizations throughout the country. Many of the ideas which have been incorporated into the current ARCI model rules. Much of what I refer to and will discuss will be prior to the implementation of HISA, although there has been statements that we weren't working on some of these safety things. I just want to reiterate that a lot of these are concepts that we've had for many years and that regulators such as yourselves have been working to implement. With regards to the jockeys, we've been working for over a decade with the industry to adopt safety and standards such as improvements to safety equipment, properly staffed and ready to transport advanced life support or mobile ICU, ambulances with at least one paramedic in the morning and 2 paramedics in the afternoon. With the ambulances who are following the fields unless otherwise excused by the stewards, concussion protocols and return to ride guidelines for all injuries, as well as centralized health database for the medical providers at the racetracks to have access in the event that a jockey is injured. Mandatory pre-race examinations, and various other improvements to the racetracks specifically for safety. However, due to the lack of enforcement, communication, and/or cooperation, many of these protocols and programs have either not been successful or have simply been overlooked. With that being said, I'm going to give you a little bit of background and then I'll move into specifics. Obviously, there's dangers and risks of being a jockey. Every single morning during workouts, there's hundreds of horses that are training in the mornings. There's inexperienced jockeys and exercise riders that are out on the track. Daily, they also have to worry about their weight concerns. There's diets, there's methods that they use in order to obtain the weight. They are sitting in a hot box for hours in order to pull that weight, or they're using other methods known as flipping or heaving. There are diuretics and laxatives that are involved. The dangers of this trying to obtain are dehydration, leads to the lower cognitive functions, and diet or workloads that leads to lower bone mineral density and/or osteoporosis. The stress of the riders is they are hired and fired daily. They must stay healthy in order to compete or to be able to even make financial, to provide for their families. And then there's the cost or lack of disability insurance that leads many of the jockeys to return to riding prior to the time that they should be prior to the time that they are most fit and should be returning. Injuries happen in racing at any moment. It can be in the paddock, the post parade, the starting gate, during the race, or even pulling up after the race. I tell you this to remind you that while we are talking about these safety things and some of the items that the Guild asked for, while they say that there's a cost, some great, some not, affiliated with these requests, we must remember that the jockeys are risking their lives every time they get a leg up. It is not a matter of if a jockey is going to be injured, it's when a jockey is going to be injured. Jockeys are one of the only professions, with the exception of possibly military, in which an ambulance is actually following you as you do your job. When a jockey is injured, the racetracks in Texas have a $1 million on-track accident policy. As many of you are aware that there were some concerns previously earlier in the year, with regards to that coverage. The on-track accident policies of $1 million the policy must be a primary policy, and it must be one that is accepted by local providers and specialists. Prior to HISA, the Guild was and will continue to get unified rules adopted by the individual state commissions. Although Texas has not signed on with HISA, which we recognize and respect, there are still many areas, even within HISA, that is still left to the state regulators. For the safety and benefits of the jockeys, there's the emergency procedures and protocols that must be followed, including the medical care provided by the associations, as well as the ambulances being properly staffed, fully equipped, and ready to transport. Safety standards, licensing of the jockeys, scale of weights, which Texas, I believe a year ago, adopted the most current scale of weights. Weigh out and weigh in procedures allowing for inclement weather gear, pre-race examinations, on-track warning systems, requiring the racetracks to provide the commissions with the copies of those on-track accident policies that I had referred to, as well as providing a copy of that in the jockey's quarters so that the riders may be aware of all the benefits and limits to those policies. Added starting gates and limited use on shockwave therapy. These are just a couple areas or a few areas where we are going to discuss today. With regards to licensing, and again, these all relate to safety, the licensing of both the jockeys and the apprentice riders must take into consideration that these individuals are physically capable of doing so, including their annual physicals that must be required and completed, as well as the baseline tests, which I will refer to when I discuss the concussions. They must also have the competence and ability prior to licensing to demonstrate their riding ability, which may include the participation of up to 5 races with the prior approval of the stewards, with the consideration of recommendations from the starter, the head outrider, and the designated representatives of the jockeys and the horsemen at the track. This includes breaking with the horse and company from the starting gate, working a horse and company around the turn and down the stretch, switching the riding crop from one hand to another while maintaining control of the horse in the stretch drive, and causing a horse to switch leads coming out of the turn. While many of the states have this licensing requirement for jockeys and apprentice riders, we believe that this should also be applicable to exercise riders, as many of the incidents that occur in the morning do occur as a result of things that could have been prevented had the exercise riders been more properly trained or competent in what they were doing. The medical care, and I apologize, I'm going as quickly as I can. I'm just trying to hit these bullet points for all of you because I don't want any of you to fall asleep on me while I'm trying to discuss some of these things. The medical care, ambulance, and paramedics are of the utmost importance as provided by the associations. The licensed associations must provide a first aid room that is equipped with at least 2 beds and other appropriate equipment, and the service at least 1 physician, nurse practitioner, or paramedic. We believe that they shall also provide mandatory orientation of racing emergencies procedure for all emergency response personnel employed or assigned as a result of the contract by the association grounds. This includes having communication with their local Trauma 1 center. This includes having communication and procedures in place in the event of a multiple horse spill involving multiple riders. Based on the recommendations of the Jockeys Guild, and this is something that we had created when we were actively involved with the NTRA Safety and Integrity Alliance. I must note that we are not anymore and have not been affiliated with them for approximately the last 2 years, because it became to our attention that they were not actually enforcing these rules that they were stating were required in order for an association to be accredited. But we do believe that there should be a medical director or staff oversight, that the on-site emergency medical staff should be a registered licensed nurse with experience in emergency medicine, certified paramedics to be present during the races, as well as at least 1 in the morning during training, and emergency medical technicians to assist the lead paramedic, nursing team, and medical director. The use of the Trauma Level 1 facilities is of the utmost importance. The reason I say this is jockeys, when they experience a spill, they are going anywhere from 35 to 38 miles per hour. Not only that, when they hit and they land, the impact, while we have safety equipment on, that's still a significant impact to the body, not to mention if they are stepped on or hit by the other horses in the race. Because of that, a lot of times the incidents are either something very simple, we say simple, a broken collarbone, broken ribs, something that is obvious and although painful is not as serious, or it is something catastrophic, whether it be traumatic head injury, traumatic spinal cord injury, and or internal bleeding or injury to internal organs. The difference, and there's a lot of racetracks that say, well, we have EMTs and we have ambulances, so that's okay. And we've had to explain over the years there's a vast difference between emergency medical technicians and paramedics. Paramedics, EMTs usually receive 120 to 150 hours training before they are licensed as an EMT. Paramedics usually receive anywhere from 1,200 to 1,800 hours. The other thing that is most vital with paramedics is their ability to break skin. Most states do not allow the EMTs to give shots or intravenous lifelines, or restrict the use are restricted to using oxygen, glucose, asthma inhalers, and auto injectors. The paramedics are trained to use 30 to 40 different medications depending on the state. One example that I will give is we had a jockey who was severely injured during Breeders' Cup race in 2012. At that time, California had just changed the requirement of the paramedics. Had he not had a paramedic, had there not been paramedics there to put the appropriate line in and to break skin, he would not have survived transport to the hospital. That person is John Velasquez. It's very well known, and he is the chairman of our guild. So we've seen firsthand experience on multiple jockeys of the difference between paramedics and EMT. The other area that we've really been trying to work on is protocols and return to ride guidelines for concussions. The ones that we had originally created that were adopted by our board were created through the collaboration of the University of Kentucky, Dr. Kelly Ryan of Maryland, MedStar, and the New York Institute of Technology. These are not protocols that the jockeys themselves came up with. They are similar to many other professional sports. Since that time, there have been some changes because this has been approximately 8 years ago. Just recently, they are getting ready to change from the SCAT-5, which is the Sports Concussion Assessment Test. They are getting ready in the next year to change it to a SCAT-6, which will have additional requirements under that baseline test and in the evaluation in the event that an athlete or a jockey has been possibly concussed. The other thing that I would like to say with the concussions, the protocols that we have put in place and that I will submit to the Texas Racing Commission for consideration, as well as this rules committee, they are done with the possibility of being conducted at any level of racetrack. It doesn't matter if it's one of the top tracks or one of the smaller fair meets. These take into consideration how it can be done and what is necessary in order to assess if an individual has been concussed and needs to be further evaluated by a neurologist and a medical professional. In order to do so, the associations must ensure that there are staff and officials who are trained in the identification of the potential concussion and that those written protocols are available. Now, the jockeys have a responsibility to make sure that those protocols are in place, and they have to be aware that they will be required to comply with those protocols. That includes prior to the beginning of any meet that they have a baseline test in place, or a baseline assessment in place, so that baseline is there in order to be able to compare it in the event that there's a possible injury. There's more that I can go into with the concussions, but I think, as a country, we're definitely more, and with all sports, we're definitely more aware of the necessities and why we need concussion protocols at any sort of athletic event, including horse racing. With the one area that we've had, in light of the fact the racetracks have not adopted the centralized database that was available through the racetrack operating. There has been concerns about using the one that was provided through the RTO. However, we believe that the protocols and procedures, along with the return to ride guidelines, can still be implemented by the associations. Additionally, many of the racetracks in the Mid-Atlantic, as well as Kentucky, are working together to create some sort of uniformity. Moving forward with HISA, this will also be a requirement under HISA. There is a new medical director who is in place and who is in communication. He's just recently been appointed. His name is Dr. Pete Hester. The Jockeys Guild actually has a very good working relationship with Mr. Hester, or Dr. Hester, and we believe that he will be beneficial to the industry moving forward. Stepping outside of the medical, the other issues are the safety equipment. There are minimum standards that must be in place for the helmets and vests, as well as the riding crops. Those standards are to assure the safety of the jockeys, as well as all other participants that are on horseback and or working with the horses in the starting gate, without compromising their ability to move and their reaction time. We've worked for the creation of a helmet for the jockeys and exercise riders that are lightweight, comfortable, inexpensive, and protects them for both high and low impact falls. Many of the people that have had complaints over the current or newer helmets say that they break easily, or they don't hold up like my old Caliente. I can use my Caliente and I've had it forever and it still is in shape. I've had it for 25 years and there's nothing. The problem with that is the Caliente or the older helmets, they're not absorbing the impact. Your brain, your skull, your head is what's absorbing the impact. And so the new helmets, they do break when there's a severe impact, but that's because it's absorbed the impact and dissipated. One area that we're still having problems with, and I think this is with all aspects of sports, and I'm sure you've heard it with NFL, is eliminating the concussions. We still have not been able to do so, which is why it's necessary that we have those concussion protocols in place. We will continue to work for the safety vest manufacturers to increase the product lines for newer and safer technology, and continue to work with ASTM here in the United States. With that being said, there are 4 helmets that are permissible and 5 riding vests, different lines. There have been questions about the new rules having these extra, or they've changed because there's additional helmets and vests. That was done in order to give more variety and, again, eliminating or reducing the costs to the individuals that need those. It wasn't to eliminate the old ones unless they were not safe or had not met the safety standards. With regards to the riding crop, Texas's rule, it does need to be changed. It is the old rule, which nobody is using those riding crops. Those are the old leather feathers of the 2 poppers. Those are the riding crops that were cutting horses. Those were changed in 2008 after a situation with 8 Bells. The Guild worked with the Jockey Club and others throughout the country in order to get the Pro Cush or the cushioned riding crops. The vast majority of jockeys are using those, including the jockeys in Texas. So I think we can just change that rule and it'll be something simple. The one thing I would recommend doing different than the way HISA has proposed this is allowing for the jockeys to still either use the cushioned riding crops, the Pro Cush, or the cylinder riding crops if they so choose to do so. We don't believe that it's necessary, or we don't believe that it's right that jockeys should be restricted in the riding crop that they should be using if both alternatives are still safe and appropriate for use of the horse, equine, or humane. The next area that I think we believe is absolutely essential is pre-race examinations. We support mandatory pre-race veterinary examinations as the only real guarantee against unsafe races on the racetrack. We believe there should be a stronger emphasis on the responsibility of the veterinarians in the afternoon to scratch horses which are not warming up soundly during the pros parade. And there's an obligation and duty of all participants to assert that the animals are in the best condition possible and are fit to run in a race before the jockeys are ever given a leg up. It's necessary for the pre-race examination to be by a veterinarian in order to make that determination. There are assessments that are in place, including actually feeling, touching, palpating the horse, observing the horse in motion and doing a manual palpation or a passive flexion in both of the forelimbs. The reason we say that is there's a lot of jurisdictions that, again, in the past had said they had pre-race exams. A vet would go out and watch him jog. They wouldn't actually touch the horse. They wouldn't realize that there were some other things going on with the horse. So we think that the pre-race exams are one of the most vital parts happening during the day. With regards to the therapies that are being used on the backside for the care of horses, as much as the use of prohibited drugs, and I'm not not to be confused with the therapeutic medications, the use of the extracorporeal shockwave therapy or the radial pulse wave therapy are a greater concern for our riders. It has been for an extended period of time, and the Guild and the jockeys believe it shall not be permitted unless it's done under specific and uniform conditions as determined by the Commission and recommendations of your veterinarian. including restricting the amount of time before a horse is permitted to return to workouts and racing. Additionally, the use of such therapy shall be reported beforehand and shall be recorded on the designated vets list. With regards to drug and alcohol testing, that is one that is already in your existing rules, but I believe will be moved into section 304. I'm trying to keep up with the move of the rules in which section. Drug and alcohol testing is something that is absolutely important for the jockeys, but that testing shall not be limited to just the jockeys. It needs to be conducted on all of those who are in direct contact with the horses or whose position may have an impact on the outcome of the race. We say this, that we believe it needs to include your assistant starters, your valets, and any racing officials. Without taking, those are some of the most, again, this is about safety, and that's their occupations are some of the most essential for assuring safety of not only the horse, but also the jockey. We, the Guild, and our members recognize and appreciate the efforts that you have put forth since August and moving forward into the next year of getting all these rules changed and up to and improving the safety for both the human and equine athletes, as well as the integrity and the public perception of our sport. These updated changes and rules are all necessary for our sport to ensure the racing, the safest racing environment, while creating some sort of uniformity for the riders, especially since we do have such a transient and mobile industry where the trainers, horsemen, jockeys, exercise riders, they're all going from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. Our ultimate goal is to assure that jockeys are riding, as I said, under the safest, and as an industry, we must be everything we can to prevent these industry injuries and make the racetracks as safe as possible. In order to do so, we all need to work together to continue to provide research and analysis of the racetrack incidents, whether or not the injuries do occur. Continue working with all the manufacturers and producers to ensure the products are suitable and reliable for our jockeys, exercise riders, and all people on horseback. Continue working to ensure proper rules are adopted and enforced. Working with the industry groups to gain support for the safety initiatives that we're all working on. And then when an accident does occur, because we know we can't prevent them, we need to do everything possible to provide care and benevolence for those jockeys. And then we also need to work on creating education initiatives for our fans, the local and state governments, and public in general to realize what we are doing. So there are so many out there that are criticizing our sport and our industry. We need to show what we are doing to make it better, what we are doing for the protection and benefit of all of our industry and the participants. In closing, the Guild has a vested interest in all of the proposed rules and working closely with your commission and this committee to improve the perception of our sport and ensuring that it's conducted in the safest manner possible for both the equine and human athletes. We're hopeful we can work together with this committee and the full Texas Racing Commission to achieve such goals. However, we must have full consideration of the realities of our sport and work together to establish an effective and uniform set of rules that are fair and balanced.
Okay.
If you have any questions, I tried to throw about 40 different rules into a 10-minute presentation. I do apologize.
Mindy, thank you. I have a few, but first of all, Judge Pate has joined us by Zoom, so hello, Judge. Great to see you. Hope everything is good. Does anyone have any questions for Mindy before I start barraging her with a few of my own? Anyone? Okay. Mindy, just a couple questions. You were listing what you all consider appropriately trained medical personnel. Would a physician assistant be an equivalent to a nurse practitioner in your list?
Yes.
Okay. As much as it would be great if we had a level 1 trauma center next door to every racetrack, I don't think that that's feasible, especially if we have, class 3 or 4 or even class 2 racetracks. Most of our big cities have got trauma centers, but still it's a time and distance thing. Does the Jock Guild have any consideration of telemedicine? Because if you're before you start to transport someone, the first rule of medicine is first do no harm. So having a link. Do you want to transport, or does this need a life flight or whatever? Is telemedicine anywhere in your guidelines?
As of right now, we had, obviously, telemedicine has made more of a advance in the last 3 to 4 years, and then especially during COVID times. Those were not included in the guidelines. However, with that being said, there are being revisions to the guidelines now for what's actually reasonable and practical. Additionally, some of the jurisdictions in which they do not have a level 1 trauma center have also provided for or created a heliport to provide an area in the event that the jockey and or jockeys need to be air-backed out of the area in order to
Okay, just taking...
quickly obtain the necessary medical care.
Absolutely. Just taking a look at telemedicine and exploring that a little bit further, that might also be a more economical way to have access to a higher level professional. If you have telemedicine and a paramedic or a PA or even an EMT, if you're just doing a follow-up exam, you can have a very qualified person at the other end of a computer, which might not be a practical thing to actually have a neurologist come and be making house calls to the racetrack. So just, there's a lot going on in telemedicine right now, and it might give us a higher level of care and have the right person sit chairside with the jockey, like you said, especially for taking a look at baselines or follow-up exams. If you've got a board-certified neurologist on the computer, then a highly qualified EMT or a paramedic can, tee up the ball and provide the data to that professional.
Absolutely. One of the areas, and I apologize, the one thing to be very clear, it does not have to be a neurologist or somebody trained. As demonstrated throughout other sports, the person that is trained to assess or determine if an individual is concussed doesn't even have to be a medical provider. There are team physicians, team trainers, athletic trainers, and or individuals who are trained in concussion and baseline assessment. All they do is responsible to determine whether or not that individual is concussed or they believe that that person is concussed, and then they refer them out or make sure that they get the proper medical care that they need. But they can do that initial assessment at the racetrack.
Okay, I think as you work through the guidelines, and then as we take a look at our job, we want to have things that are taking care of the people, but we also want to be, if we are going to make something a requirement, we want to make it realistic for the track to be able to provide what is needed without compromising lives, but also what's feasible. Some of what we have talked about in other discussions, we're very aware that the time of year and what the jockeys are going through to try to maintain weight, and that there's a limited number of qualified jockeys. And if we have racing that, race days are in close proximity to one another, we might have jockeys who are out on the road, trying to get from one racetrack to another when they're already dehydrated, they haven't eaten, and they're trying to go to make post time at the next place. So that's something that we're taking a look at, because we don't want to have them, wrapping themselves around a tree on the road, because that $1 million policy might not kick in. So
Right.
Jockey safety is not only on the racetrack, but as they're trying to meet the needs of their job, we want to make sure that we're not putting them in a position that they can't manage themselves. It's a tough business no matter what they do. Okay, anyone else have questions for Mindy? I mean, there's a lot to cover here, and I think that we're going to be visiting a lot of these things, but jockey safety is certainly a concern. Like I said, they have a tough job. I've followed a lot of horses around the racetrack working as a vet, and also my military medicine kicks in a little bit on that traumatic brain injury, so we want to do what we can to help manage these folks. Okay, anything else on this topic?
Well, I
Virginia?
might just raise something Mindy and I had discussed a little bit beforehand, that they are moving from the SCAT 5 to the SCAT 6 as far as the assessment of concussions. But I think, Mindy, if you could go in, I think the Jockeys Guild as well is looking into other alternatives of those assessment tests as well. Is that correct? And that they'll provide us more information as we work through these rules on those types of assessment tests?
Yes, that's correct. The medical providers for the British Horse Racing Authority, as well as Ireland have just returned from the Amsterdam Concussion Conference. And while they were there was discussion about the changes that would be made. There's also some consideration for jockey lifestyle, which includes our obviously trying to make weight and or for the jockeys that have ADHD or learning disabilities. So they're trying to figure out ways to accommodate those issues that are a reality to our sport. Like I said, the SCAT-6 will be something new. As I said earlier, the SCAT-6 will be a new method that is going to be adopted by the other racing jurisdictions throughout the world and other sports in general. But there are some other ideas that have been discussed that's new technology, to be quite frank. It's some of the methodology that's being used by military, for example, and other professions. And as we get that information, it's something that's regularly evolving. And as we get that information, we're going to adapt and include that in our information.
Great. We look forward to working with you and in the industry. We want to come up with the right answer to give as much care as we possibly can. We also want to make that level of care attainable so the racetracks are able to provide it. So we have to find, where's that sweet spot that we can take care of business and also not have to build a hospital right on the grounds of the racetrack. That might be prohibitive. Okay. All right. Any other comments or questions for Mindy on this topic? Okay. Vanessa, are there any public comments on the draft 304 on licensing? Do we want to do 302?
Let's see.
You list 302.
Let's look at.
I'm sorry, did I get a whole,
Yeah.
sorry, I got ahead of you. I was taking so many notes, I was fascinated. Sorry. We'll now move on to Agenda 2, invited testimony. We got Mindy. We'll now move on to Agenda Item 3A, additional public comments on 302, which was originally presented at the September 13th meeting at the Gillespie County Fairgrounds. Do we have any comments for 302?
Thank you, Vanessa. And
Sorry,
just-
Mindy, I had 2 pages of notes, so I got ahead of myself.
And just
I
so,
apologize. I tried to condense it as much as I could for you.
That's all right. That's
part
all
of the handouts at the table are some of the public comments that have been submitted to the Racing Commission in the interim since the September 13th public meeting that we held at the barn in Gillespie.
Okay. Mary Rule. Nice to see you, Mary. Thank you for coming.
Thank you. Question. Are we on?
Yeah, I think so.
You said, Virginia, my comments were not included.
No, they
Okay.
came right before, so
All right.
please bring those up.
All right, I'll try to keep these very brief. Some of this we've discussed before, some of it we have not. For instance, the definitions, and I know that there are some issues with definitions that are in the Racing Act that are not in the rules and so forth. For instance, I'm not going to get into that. I'm just going to deal with some questions that I have. As far as Rule 302, 200 commission responsibilities, it looks like, and this is on page 19 of the materials, the renewal of inactive racetrack licenses was struck through, and issued training facility licenses is added. Why are the inactive racetrack licenses struck through? Is that dealt with somewhere else?
Well, if I can, we wanted to include the training licenses, but that renewal of inactive licenses will probably remain unless there is any change with the Racing Act. So it is not meant to be struck through at this point in time, although there is consideration as we move into Chapter 309 currently and the new 304, that we look at those factors for inactive racetrack licenses and active racetrack licenses. Because bottom line, if you're not racing, you're maybe not a racetrack. And so there will be some consideration for that. But because of the fact that it is in the Racing Act and it's statutory, that will require some legislative intent enactment. So
Okay.
it's going to remain, and that we'll fix that.
Gotcha. Thank you very much.
No, thank you.
Also, in Rule 302-201, Commission Meetings Procedures is talking about a quorum, and this, again, is being struck through. Is that addressed somewhere else in the rules?
It's not addressed. There's been some consideration with the Roberts Rules of Procedure, and the quorum is defined within that, and there's a portion of the open meetings part of that rule that mentions the Roberts Rules of Procedure, and because it's defined within that, we didn't want to be redundant, but that's so noted from your public comment. So
Okay.
we will keep that in mind when we look at addressing these rules in finality.
Great. My next question has to do with licensee of the commission or a member of the public requesting an item be placed on the agenda by filing a written request with the executive director. Used to be, I'm not sure, are we adding 14, are we changing it to 14 days or changing it to 21 days?
Changing it to 21, and that's for preparation of meetings. They're every other, month. And so we felt like 14 days before a meeting was a little bit short on notice because the meeting agenda typically is filed 7 days before the meeting. And because 14 days is only a week before, we wanted to ensure that we had sufficient time to allow those that asked for an agenda item that it actually be included if it was decided to do so. So
Right.
I hope that the 21 days doesn't cause too much conflict, but it would ensure that that would be timely produced on the agenda to be filed with the public.
Okay. The next one is 302-250, allocation of race days. And it says the commission may not grant overlapping live race dates for the same breed of horses at struck through Class 1 racetracks unless the overlapping is agreed to in writing by the affected Class 1 racetracks. Tell me what this means.
I believe that the idea is to not have overlapping days for the other tracks, Class 2 as well as Class 1. That was my understanding on that strike-through. As everybody may be aware today, we don't have Amy here, who was called away, but it was my understanding that we don't want a lot of conflicting race days. It's been a problem that was brought up even at the Gillespie meeting where people would move from, say, Gillespie over, so we wanted to make sure that it covered all tracks as opposed to just Class 1. But I would have to seek additional.
Yeah, I'll add a little bit more, and again, this is why we're having these meetings, so we can get the input and we can have crosstalk. It was brought up at Gillespie, but, with plans from other organizations that are also looking at building tracks, and we have a limited pool of some key people. If we have racing that is perhaps an afternoon and then at another track in an evening, and Texas is a big place, a lot of folks forget to take a look at that little scale down at the bottom of the map. If you have people who are working a race meet in an afternoon, and then they have to get to the other track, and they have, they're out there driving unreasonable speeds, country roads, you name it, because they have an obligation, but if they don't ride, or if they're starters or assisting, just any of the people who would be spread between the two, it was brought to our attention in no uncertain terms that there's a real safety issue on people trying to make their obligations at two different places at very distant tracks when they're already working a job that is inherently dangerous. Racing in the summertime in Texas is going to have its own risk factors there. So we decided it's something that we need to be a lot more deliberate when we take a look at, are we putting people unnecessarily in danger by having those kinds of pressures put on them. And, it was made very clear to us that there's a risk that we really hadn't addressed.
Right, thank you. The next thing is, let's see, in determining whether to approve a request under the subsection, that's for race dates, the executive director may consider the effect that approving the request would have on the workload and budget status of the commission. And my question is, why does that come into play? Would it not be possible if the commission decides that adding or anything about the meet, if it could not be handled under the current fees, could they not add an additional per day fee? Is that what this is referring to?
I believe that it's just a factor that the executive director looks at in the request for additional days, correct? And so you have to look at it can be part of the additional race day and add that fee, right? And that's been done by the commission in the past. But we've run into at least situations, particularly when you have the overlapping days, et cetera. If you're going to request additional days, that executive director should look at all the factors considering that within the realm of the granting of the additional days. So again, I believe it's just a factor analysis that everyone can understand that the executive director employs when they look at the additional request for days. And that would be a workload factor. So, you know, we have a lot of staff that work several meets and run for consecutive, and they're entitled to like have some time to themselves, have time off, right? And in looking at that and the request for additional days, if she's going to run up against that in the shortage of staffing or the shortage of resources and whatever nature that may be. So again, it's just a factor consideration that everyone, racetracks and participants can look at. Well, this is what currently she is looking at for the request in and of itself.
Right, and you know, we have an obligation. Oh, go ahead, sir.
I'm sorry, Commissioner McNabb. I just wanted to add, Mary, this is one of what we're building into our appropriations request and our whole design and refunding the agency is to put ourselves in a position where we have sufficient number of employees in order to execute the regulatory function with a bit more flexibility. I think in the immediate sense, it's something of a concern to the executive director, and hopefully out in the future as we get hopefully better financed and more employees in place so we have some redundancy in some positions, that would certainly be less of a factor. And I also want to mention here, in case I have to get off this call, I really would appreciate Ms. Coleman's comments. They're very important to us, and I just am really glad I was able to listen to most of them and invite their ongoing assistance as we go through these rules. I really appreciate it. Anyway, I just wanted to mention that. There's another reason why we all need to help the whole agency when we get to funding here in the next legislative session.
Great. I appreciate the clarification.
And Mary, just to add on to what the judge said, we have an obligation to the industry to provide you with our regulatory folks who have the skills and experience to come out and actually give you a good determination on something. Finding experienced, qualified regulatory veterinarians, they are not growing on trees. And then, as the judge alluded to, it's also a matter of there might be some good veterinarians, but for the resources that we have to pay them, it doesn't pencil out. So it's a staffing matter, it's a planning matter, if indeed we're able, and we want to accommodate the industry as much as possible, but just pinning a rose on somebody who doesn't have the experience to say, well, they have a DVM, so we're sending them out there. You and I know that isn't going to give you the kind of assurance. So we're doing our best, but we're coming up out of a staffing situation that has been less than ideal, and our goal is to be able to be the kind of agency that we can be responsive. But bear with us as we grow, and we'll try to do our best.
Right, and the main reason I'm asking these questions is because the rules as they're written don't provide some explanations that I think are very valuable to have and to know why these rules are written as they are. The other has to do with charity race dates, and the section or paragraph K says an association shall apply to the commission not later than July 1st of each year for charity race dates. Should this date coincide with the date for regular racetrack date applications? Is there a reason for those to be earlier? For the charity days to be requested earlier?
It was written that way. I'm not sure why that was written like that, and I think it should coincide.
Gotcha.
And so if it's not clear by the revision that we have in there, then certainly we need to make that correction, because I think that the charity race days go with the allocation of race days, and that should all come to the commission at one time. And I don't see where it really facilitates anything if we allow them to submit charity race days before the
Right,
race day.
right.
Yeah, and so if that's not clear in that rule, it certainly should be, and that was the intent of the drafter here. So,
And we think
I'll
that this,
note that.
this is a great opportunity for the racetracks, building community support, that those charity days can really be
Sure.
a valuable event for them.
The next two questions just have to do with language or on page 23, the Rule 302-252, the allocation of the live race dates for Class 1s. This is struck through. Has it been deleted or has it been moved?
I'm sorry, Mary, could you repeat that again?
On page 23 of the
Okay.
materials,
Uh-huh.
302-252, allocation of live race dates for Class 1 racetracks.
Okay. 252?
Yes, ma'am. It's the second paragraph on, I'm sorry, it's page 23.
I think we might have had a different set of rules, but when you cite out 302-252, I'm coming up with a seal of the commission, but allocation or change in that race day allocation in my materials would be on 13 page, and it's subsection I, is that right?
No, I'm looking at page 23 and what was available online, and it is the second paragraph, and it does say Rule 302.252, allocation of live race dates for Class 1 racetracks, old Rule 303.43.
Okay. And so again, could you go through what your question was? Or
Well, has it been moved somewhere else?
It may be in our materials is not where we're finding it. Yeah.
Okay.
But
Basi-
go ahead, please, for the record.
Right, basically, it talks about the overlapping race dates for any year in which there are less than 3 Class 1 tracks in Texas holding non-appealable license. Commission shall allocate to each such racetrack at least 17 consecutive weeks of live thoroughbred racing and 17 consecutive weeks of live quarter horse racing. Is that still in place somewhere, or is it being repealed?
Well, this has come up as an issue, correct? And 17 consecutive weeks has not been, how should I say this, feasible, I guess, is in the allocation of these live race days, right? There's not been a request for an allocation of live race dates for 17 consecutive weeks,
Correct.
right? And so it's not that it's being removed, but it's certainly being considered because it's not been feasible, it's not been requested,
Right.
right?
Right.
And so in looking at the rule, do we want to shorten that, because that's actually what is happening, as opposed to making it kind of something that it shall be, okay?
Okay.
And doing something more along the lines that it may be a permissible word instead of shall, we would say something like, it may be 17 consecutive weeks, right?
Okay.
And that would be just a permissible slight language, as opposed to saying it's a mandatory for a Class 1 track to say that you shall have 17 consecutive weeks.
Right.
It's not been shall. I mean, it's not been done that way. By changing the shall to the may and making it feasible to do it, but not a necessity or a requirement for allocation of live race days, is what we're trying to do there, accomplish there.
Okay, yeah, I was just confused by the way it was presented on the page.
And I'll relook at how it's being presented, because
Okay.
that's key.
Great. My next refers to page 40, and it is Rule 302.1 authority. Get to that page.
2.1. Oh, that would be at the very beginning.
In paragraph 3, It's talking about the law, rules, and orders of the board supersede the conditions of a race, so on and so forth. The breed registry organizations are the Jockey Club for Thoroughbred Racing, the American Quarter Horse Association for Quarter Horse Racing, the Arabian Horse Registry of America for Arabian Racing, and the American Paint Horse Association for Paint Racing. Should these be identified as national breed registries?
Certainly, if that's the case, that probably should be that way.
Right. And in other sections of 302, we are talking about the state breed registries, which is Texas Thoroughbred, Texas Quarter Horse, Texas Arabian, and so on. I think it would be helpful to have that distinction, what kind of registry it is, if it's national or state.
Yes, ma'am. I think that's a great point.
And then I have a question on page 47, because I've never noticed this before, and it just got my curiosity up. Item 100, and this is the second paragraph on my page 47.
Okay.
Rather than page, can you tell me which rule? Because I think we've been working in preparation, and so the page numbers might be different on what you have.
I see. That's a good question.
I hate to interrupt, but I'm going to have to attend another meeting, but thank you very much for all y'all's attendance, and appreciate your leadership, Commissioner McNabb.
Thank you, Judge. Appreciate it.
And if you want, Mary, you can just go over the gist of the rule,
Right.
because we did have a posted draft of 304, but and when I get to the presentation portion of it, that's why our page numbers aren't coinciding.
Okay.
We pulled that down because we're going to make some additional revisions and present that before the commission meeting, hopefully
Okay.
have those posted.
I think this is still in 302, and it's a lot of definitions.
Okay.
And this one is the definition of wager.
Okay,
It
it'll be
says-
in alphabetical order.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay.
It says a sum of money or other valuable item based on the outcome of an uncertain event such as a horse or greyhound race. What is other valuable item? Don't know.
Yeah. This definition was obtained from the ARCI rule, if I recall correctly. It was added, I note that this was added after our meeting at the Gillespie Park. The suggestion was that a definition for wager be included.
Yeah.
And, gosh, what would other valuable item be for a
I
wager?
don't
It'd be
know.
a sum of money, would it
Could be a
not?
pickup truck, you know.
I don't know that the
Anyway.
racing office would take a pickup truck as a wager, so.
It depends. If it was a brand-new one, maybe. But
Okay.
anyway, that's all I have. My other...
Your recommendation, Mary, would be to scrap that or other valuable item?
Yeah, probably
All right.
so. Or else
So
designate
noted.
somebody the czar that gets to decide what that...
Legal tender.
So noted. And Mary, if I can just say from the Texas Thoroughbred Association, we really appreciate all of your help on these rules because I know it's kind of an arduous task. And
I
you
do
have
not
been-
want your job.
But you have been you have facilitated this process, and we really do appreciate you attending all these meetings thus far and giving us these comments because they're invaluable. So thank you
Well,
very much.
we always appreciate the opportunity to learn together. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mary. Okay, Kelly Schumacher? No, ma'am, I have no comments. Okay. All right, Scott Sherwood.
Scott has comments.
Scott's always got some valuable insight.
Just a few.
Hi, Scott.
Kind of to continue on with what Mary was talking about, this rule, the 302-250, that talks about the agreement for the race dates and stuff. I can understand your problem with the staffing and the riders and stuff. The Gillespie Retama is the only example, really, that happens in Texas right now.
Right now.
But what I'm looking at is you've got a lot of places that are applying for dates, these new racetracks that are supposedly going to be built. I think the Class 1 tracks need to have a little bit of a advantage over the race date applications and not have to be fighting with a Class 3 or a Class 2 over race dates. For example, if someone wants to put a racetrack at a fair meet somewhere up here in the Fort Worth area and they want to run it a prime weekend that Lone Star wants to run at, does Lone Star have to get a written agreement with that racetrack in order to keep their dates and run that weekend that they were, or that time of the year that they were wanting to run? According to this rule, the way y'all are going to have it written, it's going to be they have just as much leverage, a Class 3 or a Class 2, as a heavily invested Class 1 racetrack. So that's one of the issues. I think the thing needs to be rewritten in a way to where the Class 1s have, say, a first right of refusal on some of those dates.
I think from the regulatory point of view, I think we can agree that there has to be some kind of negotiation, and it might be, let's not do it on the same date, isn't there some other time? But if indeed we do have overlapping dates, making sure that indeed we have sufficient qualified riders, staff, so forth. So,
But a great example is what happened at Gillespie, where Gillespie has a couple of weekends that they base their stuff around, but they used to call it reunion weekend. It's that second weekend that they race in July. And then, of course, fair weekend. Mm-hmm. That first weekend they race, July 4th weekend, is, just a weekend. And Retama was scheduled to run that same weekend. And my comment when me and Rob were talking about it was, who's to say that they're more patriotic in Fredericksburg than they are in Selma, Texas? And so Retama agreed to move and change their dates, added a couple extra dates for us, which was on a Wednesday, which doesn't do us much good as far as handle-wise. But there was a weekend in between Houston and Retama closing that Gillespie could have run. And you wouldn't have had staff stretched out. But I know it got worked out. But it just seemed to me like you had the tail wagging the dog there when you had a Class 3 racetrack dictating what a Class 1 racetrack was going to do with their...
I hear everything you're saying, and I think that there's a lot of negotiation needs to happen. As Gillespie looks at it, they say these are our historic dates. So I think just exactly what the right piece is, I think we need to sit down and work on this some more, because I don't want to discount what you're saying on the Class 1 tracks. But also, Gillespie's, they've got dates that they've been running since before Parimutuel came in. So I think, we need to sit down and hammer through this and find out what does right look like. I don't want to discount what you're saying, because I think it's important.
And then again, like I said, I'm looking more down the road.
Understand.
What happens when, Beaumont, I know Beaumont and Houston, they worked their thing out. What if they wouldn't have? You would have had to have some kind of a written agreement between the two, which means a Class 1's negotiating with a Class 2 or a Class 3 to keep their historical dates.
Right. And I think as our industry gets stronger in Texas and we have more of a population, it will be less of an issue, but
Right.
still, racing
Okay.
needs to be safe. You have to have qualified people. You can't just grab somebody, throw them on arms.
Then the other issue on the, again, what Mary brought up about if you don't have the 3 Class 1 racetracks, again, looking down the road, if a Class 1 is forced to close, if they surrender their license, or if they opt to go to a Class 2, that's why this rule was put in place. And I understand the 17-week issue, but it also says in that rule, unless otherwise agreed to by the appropriate breed registry. So at the last meeting, this rule was basically said that it was going to be removed. I know earlier you said you were going to look at it, but at the last meeting this is gone. It's not going to stay in there because of the comment, I guess it came from Leatherman, James Leatherman, that there's no way they could ever run 17 weeks, whatever. But anyway, you get into a situation where if a Class 1 leaves, it's going to cost us some race dates big time. So we would like to see that rule stay in. We'd hope we'd never have to use it. It doesn't hurt if it sits in there and we don't ever use it. What's the big deal? It's a paragraph in a big book that hopefully we never have to look at. But if the situation arises where one of the Class 1s drops out or closes or drops to a Class 2, we'd like to have some leverage in order to keep our number of race dates in the state as they are at the Class 1 facilities. Without those race dates, our breeding program goes downhill. Everything just falls right along with it.
See, you're looking at number of race dates and not necessarily X number of consecutive weeks.
Right.
Okay. So, coming up with, this is the commitment that, you cannot fall below this number of race dates in Texas.
Well, it's basically the way the rule is written works, because it shows unless otherwise agreed to by the appropriate breed registry, which means if, for example, Class A decides to give up their Class 1 and go to a Class 2 license, and we had X number of dates throughout the state, we could negotiate to keep that same number of dates.
Right. So we want to maintain the negotiating position
Sure.
for the breed registries, that if they're not going to be here, then it needs, before you can take that action, someone has to pick up those dates, or you have to run it before you fold out.
Right.
So again, it's not.
And not necessarily the 17 weeks.
So the
'cause
17
with 4
weeks is
days
not
race
the
week.
issue, it's
You're
the
going to have
days.
situations where that's unfathomable because there's not the horse population in
Right.
there. And I mean, we realize that.
But it's the
But we don't
commitment to
want
the
it
number.
completely gone to where something happens and we're stuck with the, oh, well,
Right. So-
live with it.
So it is, if we have that they have to that there has to be a commitment to X number of race dates to give the breed registries the leverage to negotiate.
Yeah, I don't think you want to put the number in the rule. Again, I think if you leave the rule like it's written, covers it. That's just, our opinion when we talked about it at our race committee meeting. If the rule stays as is, as far as the 17 weeks with the 4 weeks, unless otherwise agreed to by the appropriate breed registry,
But
that covers everything.
the pivot point is the last phrase, unless agreed to by the breed registry.
That gives us the ability to go less than 17 weeks and less than 4 days.
So if we don't cut your knees out from under you, whether it's weeks or X number of days, just don't cut your knees out from under you. On
Exactly.
the negotiating, okay.
I mean, it's,
We can find that. we can
a
find
comment was made during our meeting that there's a reason that rule was put in there, so we just don't see the reason to have it taken out.
Okay.
Can I ask you a question?
Sure.
So we're looking at the licensing and the definitions. I think that, there's been a lot of conversation about the definitions of a Class 1 and Class 2 and Class 3, and whether that's an antiquated kind of definition, right? How do you feel about the definitions as they kind of stand, although broad and kind of sporadic throughout Chapter 309 currently? I mean, you have a Class 1 is this, and within this county, and
Sure.
only 3, and so forth. I mean, how do you feel about those definitions? Would you like to see something that would be more definitive in one spot, so to speak? This is a Class 1 racetrack. This is what constitutes a Class 2.
You could probably, looking into that, it's probably something to look at, but I think that the reason the rules were put in, or the act was put in with those definitions to restrict it to, it's got to be in populated areas. So it restricted it basically to the 3 areas that they're at.
Right.
You didn't want them popping up everywhere and someone saying, I'm a Class 1 racetrack, and
Right.
not be able to support Class 1.
Right, and in the definitions, I think there should be definitions, right? It's just, and certainly the Racing Act kind of restricts what those definitions can be, right? But as they're contained within the rules and in the application process and so forth, is there ways?
You mean on how a Class 1 racetrack should do their business?
Well, no, not do their business, but, the definitions as they're contained within the rules, right? Those number of days and so forth, right? Is there, how would you feel about a refresher of just looking at those definitions?
Yeah, we ought to look at that.
And reallocating, perhaps making them simpler for the public to understand, right? I mean, how many times have you kind of been confronted with, well, let's see, how you apply, for instance, for a racetrack license, and just how sporadic it is from the act to the rules and throughout?
I'm looking at it through a little bit of a different lens. I look at it right now as the 3 that are out there, and not to get too rude, there's 2 of them that run a Class 1 facility, and there's 1 that doesn't. And they ought to be called to the carpet to meet those Class 1 regulations.
Some of the parameters that describe an area that's around, and we've had those conversations walking around a certain track. If indeed you have a racetrack and it is built so that there isn't any hospital within, an hour and a half ambulance ride, then how do we live up to the needs for the jockeys or anybody else getting hurt? there's no ability for the people on the backside to get fed, or if people are coming in and they need to stay. So, having a Class 1 racetrack implies that there is some, municipal structure around so that, that will support the event. I mean, we know that people drive a long way to see horses run around an oval, but there's more to running a meet than having people show up and horses popping out of a gate. It's all the ancillary services and everything else. So this is an opportune time, and just from baseline, what we're trying to do is our rule book has been it's been a depository, sometimes a little bit like a receptacle of people throw things in and they find some place to stick it. And what we're trying to do, and Sunset also helped us with this, but really what our goal is, that our rules become a smaller total document, and then we've got publicly approved and coordinated procedures, processes, and so forth. But we want the rule book to be smaller words, shorter sentences, and not have to comb through the whole dang thing to do a word search. But I think for a lot of these things, this is an ideal time that as we look at things that got thrown out as concepts, these many years ago by Dr. Blodgett, who was, certainly this thing wouldn't have had the start that it did, not for his great work. But there's been a lot of water under the bridge since then. So
Right.
As we're refining this, now's the perfect time to say, okay, let's exactly say in Texas, what is a Class 1 track? What is a Class 2? What's a Class 3? Some of those things are already there and they'll remain there, but let's be more definitive, because we do have people that are interested. Texas has still got, I think, a lot of opportunity to grow in this industry, but let's make it clear so if people are coming in and wanting to make something happen here, they know what the rules of the game are. And you all on the ground are a great resource for let's get this right.
We'll shrink it down, but let's leave that other one in there like it is.
Thank you, Scott.
Thank you.
Okay, Marcia Roundtree? Great to see you, Marcia.
Good morning. Thank you again for hosting us and for working our way through this rule book. The staff's done an excellent job of laying out a roadmap. I'm trying to work my way through it, and evidently I need a GPS that speaks to me turn by turn to follow through the roadmap, so I may be getting out of line and going off the wrong exit here. But I just had a couple of comments. Rob and Mary spoke to one of the ones that I had, and that is we really would like to see the rule that was 302-252 remain in place. Even though it does say 17 consecutive weeks, it also says unless it's approved, by the breed registry. We think it's very important, and the reason it is for me is I want to go into definitions of racetracks and the classes of racetracks. I know it's in the statute, but we believe that the definition of which class of racetrack you're going to apply for and operate should depend more on the facility than demographics. And you're right, Commissioner McNabb, a Class 1 racetrack should be somewhere that has the infrastructure to support the jockeys when they need help and be able to feed the horsemen and do all the things that are required for that Class 1 racetrack. But there needs to be a lot more than just the definitions of the demographics and the population centers. We believe that owning the Class 1 racetrack license is a privilege. It's not a right, it's a privilege. And that privilege should come with standards. And we believe that each type of license should be clearly defined, what those standards are, what the expectations are. Then the public knows that if they're going to a Class 3, a Class 4, or a Class 2, or a Class 1, they know what to expect. They know that if they go to a Class 1 racetrack, they can expect that the patrons and the fans are going to be treated well. They know that food and beverages are going to be readily available. They know that there's going to be ample staff so that they don't have to wait in line and be shut out at the wagering windows. They know that it's going to be safe and clean. The restrooms are going to be in working order. It's going to be a first-class facility. And I believe that's why we call it a Class 1. It's a first-class facility. And as you move down, all those safety and standards should not be any less, but they should be different. I think each class should be defined differently. Each one has certain expectations, but they each should have different standards. And as you noted, Commissioner McNabb, we have 2 Class 1 racetracks, and we have a Class 1 racetrack that needs work. And it's very hard for me when I meet people in the public and they're not even aware that we have a racetrack in San Antonio, much less a Class 1 racetrack in San Antonio. So it would be wonderful if the Class 1 racetrack in San Antonio could be held to certain standards and could be brought up to those standards so we have a true Class 1 racetrack. So I'm not sure where that discussion needs to take place. I didn't know that it would go into definitions because those classes are defined in the Act, or if it should go down into the racetrack licenses, general provisions, or operations. Not sure, but I do think it's a discussion that we need to have. I don't think they don't have to be onerous conditions or standards, but there should be standards, and they should be kept to those standards. And I really do believe that when we're discussing those standards and we go further into racetrack inspections, that the executive director is going to write, have the racetrack inspections procedures, what gets inspected and what those standards are. I think some of these standards and definitions for these classes of racetrack should be included in those racetrack inspections that the executive director develops. So I think it's a big discussion. I think it's going to take some time and some detail, just as the discussion that Scott and Mary just brought up about who has priority over race dates, a Class 1 or a Class 4, a Class 3, because we're looking at Beaumont, we're looking at other, prospective racetracks to be built in Texas as Texas racing grows. And I think this should be something that's very clearly set out, that what is the procedure, because we may come to a time when we're not going to have a signed agreement between a Class 1 and a Class 2. What happens then? We have a stalemate, and who makes the decision? And the Horsemen's Organization, the Breed Registry, should certainly always have a voice in that, but we really need to know that once again, when you're going back to defining those classes of racetrack, who has priority when selecting race dates. So I appreciate the opportunity to bring these things up. It's a discussion that we need to have, and I really think it's important that we include those standards, whether it's in definitions or whether it's under racetrack applications or operations. I don't know. You have the roadmap, I'm just driving the car.
Well, we have a roadmap, but we want help creating the drive. And as such, Mary, I really appreciate your comments on this because, of course, everybody has to understand that we're kind of relegated by the Act, but we also have a legislative session coming up. And part of our mandate under Sunset was to reduce the obstacles and barriers to licensing. That's not just occupational licensing, which we're working on as well as racetracks, right? And in looking at all the factors, I've gone and looked at other jurisdictions, and they really don't deal in the active and inactive racetracks. I've not seen that. Maybe somebody in more experience in other jurisdictions have recognized that, but that's not something I've seen. In past sunsets, maybe not the last sunset where the agency was reviewed, it was also noted about inspections. And this is something that I think that can be resolved and through other work groups should be resolved, where racetracks understand what is going to be inspected. When the agency comes, prior to an opening of a meet or whatever, that the safety standards, that the inspections of, whether it be through tote or the racetrack itself or however those inspections are working, that there is a posted inspection checklist so that racing participants and licensees and everyone knows this is what you're going to review, stalls, stables, test barns, what holding. It's going to be there, and there's also going to be a penalty assessed. And you have a time to cure. Everyone has a time to cure those. It's not meant to be, it's to deter future actions, and it's to encourage compliance, right? And so encouraging compliance allows a racetrack or whoever is subject to those inspections understands it's online. They can go, oh, well, I'm going to have this inspected, this, and this. And if I don't fix it within 30 days after being notified of a deficiency, then 30 days thereafter, I'm going to get assessed this penalty. And the longer it goes on, of course, the greater the penalty, because we've got to deter the bad inspection or deficiency in that inspection. So I agree, and I think that the goal is for the commission, through these work groups, through the policy development, et cetera, that we inform the public by posting our policies online, by posting these inspections online, so that everyone is aware that the commission is not going to come in and go, oh, you've got a hole in a carpet, somebody might trip, and, and it's not on the list. It's going to be clear. And it's all these kinds of policies are evolving, right? They're flexible. They're added to, they're taken from, right? And which has been a problem. I also want to just say, because you've been also very helpful in helping us to develop these and start this process. And as such, everyone should know that any comments that you have as you come across these issues, or if you have a problem, it doesn't have to be on a specific chapter. It doesn't have to be pertaining to the roadmap. We want those comments now. What we're doing is we're gathering all those comments, and at each of these public meetings, we have internal meetings where our people within the agency get to contribute their thoughts on these rules, and we're having these external meetings. And all comments, whether internal or external, are going to be supplied at each of the next meetings from the last meeting to this. So today, we have the public comments on this table that were given to us since Gillespie. And we're going to be supplying those online as well. And then at the end, when we get the culmination of a good, new, even chaptered rules, we'll also have all those public comments so that people can understand where one person may have a view somewhere and another may have another, but at least we can gather those so that everybody can contribute. Anytime, any rule. The claiming rule we've discussed. And we look at other jurisdictions, but of course, within the agency itself, we're only one resource. I go and look, and I'm looking at other racetracks and other rules of racing in other jurisdictions, and I'm like, there is no active and inactive track. So I think in addition to your suggestion that we add some clarity to the class 1, 2, and 3 definitions and those processes of allocating live race dates, that we also look at that factor analysis as to whether there's some sort of a different designation on a track, right? Because I think that those can be sometimes somewhat antiquated, even whether simulcasting can occur if you've asked for live race dates. I think that that's shown itself to be a problem. It's the rule, but there's always ways to, I guess you could loop around that. And is that really feasible, right? And these are issues that should really be brought up now. It's best to do that. So no one should feel tied down to a particular chapter or roadmap as far as making public comments. We want to hear the good, the bad. If you were queen for a day, how would you like this rule to read? Okay, is it going to end up that way? Maybe not, but maybe. And now's the time to bring those up. So thank you.
That's very helpful, because when I looked at the roadmap and I look at our meetings that we're scheduling in advance, which is also very helpful to be able to put these meetings on a calendar far in advance and schedule around them. I look at them and I'm going through the rule book and I see something way back over there in another chapter. I go, aha, there's one. I need to put it on my notes, and when the time comes, then I need to jump in and make comment on it. So it's helpful to know that when I have that aha, that I don't have to hope that I remember to put it in at the appropriate time. So that's good to know that any chapter in the book we can comment on at any time. So I appreciate that.
And that works in the reason why we're providing the handouts of all the public comments is that you can call me later, like you'll do sometimes, and I appreciate it. And you'll go, hey, but I said this back here. And I'll go, yeah,
Good to
you
know.
did. I didn't
Thank
do
you
my
very
job.
much.
All right, thank you. Thank you. Do we have any other? Can you?
Do we have Rob?
Oh, we got a card? Great.
Okay.
Wow, thank you, Rob.
Just listening to everyone, I had some thoughts. Rob Wersler, Texas Court Horse Association. The one question I have regarding Class 1s, Class 2s, what's the benefit of being a Class 1 racetrack? if I have a Class 1 racetrack or Class 1, what would be the detriment to becoming a Class 2, other than having to pay $100,000 less in licensing fees?
Very good question, and we had that discussion on the phone the other day. I mean, because I was going through and saying, so why all these things? And I think a lot of this was written back as this whole baby was getting birthed, and
Right.
Dr. Blodgett was trying to come up with, let's throw something up on the wall, and then everybody ever since then. So I think, you know, it has been a prestige thing and probably a fundraising for developers and so forth. But I mean, you make a very good point. You know, I think a lot of it has to do with numbers of days and, you know.
Which we've seen in the past, they're dwindling, you know,
Right.
so. But one of the reasons we talk about what Scott was referring to and the other ladies, allowing the Class 2s and 3s to dictate to the Class 1s when they can or cannot run is one of the reasons the Class 1s were given that power, because they had such an investment.
Right.
It was so that millions of dollars, as opposed to, say, Gillespie, Manor. I know one time when, back when Corey Johnson was still here at Lone Star Park, he was fighting race dates at Manor for thoroughbred days. I mean, that far away, and Manor's thoroughbreds were much cheaper. They couldn't have competed here during this meet, but it still meant that to them. So I think that's one of the reasons that I think we have to be very careful moving forward with that distinction. Plus, coming from Florida, which if you want to see some convoluted commission rules, parimutuel rules, just look at those. Because every one that says one thing, they have another one that says the opposite. So,
Right.
But like you all saying, we appreciate you cleaning these up, because we have the same thing, probably not to the degree that Florida does, but I think it's going to be very helpful.
Just to your comment about the, you know, conflicting days, what it really gets down to is resource management.
Right.
If indeed there is a large enough jockey colony, veterinary colony, all of the things it takes to have horses come out of the gate and be safe, then I think that, you know, conflicts diminish. You know, right now being, you know, we are just barely past critical mass. So when you've got race dates happening, I think if two tracks were so far apart that people couldn't commute from the afternoon racing at one to the evening racing in another, it wouldn't be a thing. You know, and for some reason, Texas thinks that summertime is the best time of the year to have horse racing. You know, I'd say, you know, wintertime looks pretty good when you're in Kentucky. Texas looks great. But
Well, we run in the winter.
Yeah.
We need spring dates.
well, and I think, you know, it certainly is, since we're trying to take a fresh look, I think everybody needs to take a look at there really are 12 months in the year, and, you know, when are the right times rather than how we've always done it is not always the right answer. But when it gets down to conflicting dates don't necessarily mean that it has to be one or the other, but for where we sit as regulators, can we have racing that is safe and accountable and have integrity? You know, so it's if we can't do it safely, that's when, okay, now we got to, you know, do Solomon and split the baby. Or if the industry is saying we have enough and we're not going to let some jockey try to make a 500-mile drive in 2 hours so that he can get on a horse in the third race in the evening meet at the other track. You know, so I think we just need to take a look that we are not teeing up the ball for disaster.
Right.
Well, and I think part of it too, I mean, so much of the industry, the breeds, the associations have gotten together in the past. And I think when you see a lot of growth in the industry, which we're starting to experience, I mean, it's kind of strange because you see an increase in handle, et cetera, but you do see a decrease in the days. So what, you know, I think one of Amy's great comments is that not being that rock in the stream. What Sunset wants us to do is to reduce those barriers to licensing, right? which would increase growth of the industry. And perhaps maybe even getting the idea policy-wise of doing more of these work groups, because we've had some great participation, some great emails, and doing work groups and facilitating that process of organizing those race dates, you know, and having kind of a work group activity where it's all brought together and everybody can work through their processes. We all know that Gillespie has a historical kind of days that they pick, right? But that's going to cause conflicts when you have other tracks come in, right? And so it's kind of recognizing and balancing those conflicting needs and responsibilities and accommodations. But we all know that a Class 1 track has the best facilities to bring horses, you know? But I know that Gillespie has some of the best starters in the country, right, in the starting gate. So you've got all these accommodations that you want to work through. And maybe even the process of bringing together work groups, the commission facilitating that process through working groups of organizing those live race dates in the future might facilitate the process as well. Hopefully there are more than one avenue of just a rule change, but to garner that, communicate, enable, and partner.
Yeah, my father was an old thoroughbred trainer, as you know, Dr. McNabb, and I would ask him all these questions about why they did this, why this rule reads this way, you know, and he said, just remember those old timers had a reason for writing those rules that way. So I would ask him about LASIX. I'd ask him about, you know, claiming and rules and all that stuff like that. So I would urge y'all, when you do start looking at these things, it may seem like it doesn't make any difference now, but just try to remember why Dr. Blodgett wrote it in the past. And that's one of the things with the 17 consecutive weeks. And it's 136 days of racing for both breeds. So they understood what was best for Texas was the breeding industry, and the breeding industry needed to have racing opportunities, or,
Right.
you know, if you're not going to produce them, if they can't run in your state, you'll just go produce them someplace else. But
That's
anyway,
right.
thank you.
Thank you,
Okay,
Rob.
thank you. We're certainly not done with all the things we need to talk about, but we're all human beings, and physiology sometimes takes over. Do we need to take a break?
Yeah, let's do that.
At 10 minutes? Okay, it's 11:32. We'll come back at quarter till. Take a break. Are there any other comments or any other individuals who wish to comment on the proposed new chapter 302? Okay. There being no other comments, we will now proceed to agenda item 3B, discussion on the draft new chapter 304, which will combine the current rules of racing chapter 309 on racetrack licensing and chapter 311 on occupational licensing. Your agenda for this item notes subchapters A, C, and divisions within those subchapters. Okay, discussion on new chapter 304. Do we have anyone signed up to present? Or Virginia, do you want to give us?
I'll give you a rundown if that's all right. Everyone, Virginia Fields, I'm General Counsel with the Texas Racing Commission. We are working on a draft of 304, so I kind of want to give you an overview of that. What we have decided to do is to combine a lot of the odd number chapters into even numbered chapters. And in 304, it's going to be entitled Licensing, and it will include current chapters 309 and 311. 309 is regarding racetrack licensing, and chapter 311 involves the occupational licenses. I think we have roughly 59 separate licenses all the way down to chaplain, and the chaplain has to get a license, but they don't pay the fee. So we want to make it to where it is a situation where we reduce the redundancies on licensing. We reduce those obstacles to licensing. We're working on making the trainer's exam a Spanish test. We're working on changing our application forms and including those in Spanish. And again, this is to reduce those licensing barriers. As well, what we've done here in the agenda is include an outline of the licensing chapters. You'll note from chapter 309 for the racetrack licensing, it includes a lot of things with regard to railing and track surface and some information that's not necessarily part of the racetrack licensing process, but more relegated to health and safety. So when we get up to the health and safety chapter, which is why we're reintroducing part of that process today, we want to include those kinds of informations for the heights of the railings, the track surfacing, any sort of safety inspections prior to meets, et cetera, will be in the health and safety. And this is to make it easy for people to understand, oh, I want a racetrack license. I don't necessarily need to know about the surface conditions for a meet, et cetera, or the rails. Now, it's certainly relative to the facility, so some of the facility requirements for a racetrack will remain included in the racetrack licensing portion, okay? And again, under 304, the first thing that we're going to be discussing would be racetrack licenses. Subchapter B is going to be occupational licensing. And as Mindy kind of alluded to earlier, we have a subchapter C on alcohol and drug testing. And this includes basically jockeys currently. Mindy's opened up the idea for other racing participants that affect the outcome or have contact with the horses. This may be something that we contemplate, but we'll probably be moving the alcohol and drug testing to the health and safety because it does pertain to the health and safety of the racing participants. So ultimately, this chapter may be moved. You'll notice under subchapter B for the occupational licensing, we have the licensing applications and those provisions. We have criminal history and eligibility. We are contemplating for the criminal history, those that have a criminal history, to do a pre-licensing type of situation. It's done with other agencies where they submit their criminal history. They say, hey, I've got something in my background. I don't know if I'll get a license with the Racing Commission. And we'll have a licensing procedure that's kind of a pre-look at your criminal history, okay? And you look at it and we give you basically say, up to this date, and given the history that we've seen, we're gonna clear you to apply for a license, okay? And then that gives them an opportunity at least to have their past record looked at in advance of actually applying and then being denied. And they'll understand exactly why or what the ramifications are. But any prior crime typically has to be directly related to the occupation. So again, it would have to be related. For instance, arson may be a crime that's related to racing, right? And so we want to look at that application a little closer. The next is Division 3. We know that continuing education has been something that's come up through the racing industry, and we think it's very beneficial that people understand all the current trends and new items of that you should be aware of with regard to your occupation, whether that's the jockey, the trainer, or the owners. And so certainly we want to reflect back, look and see whether or not continuing education might be something, especially since the educational requirements, et cetera, have been able to be accomplished through Zoom, and it's not quite as arduous for somebody that may be out at a ranch working with their horses and stuff to go into a city that may be offering a continuing education class. And so we want to open up the floor to everybody to look and see if the benefits for continuing education, not just for trainers, but even jockeys, et cetera, might be something that could be looked at. Licensing fees, and I'm hoping that I can articulate correctly all of Amy's ideas with licensing fees. But as you are well aware, we're working on the fingerprinting status. We're trying to reduce that obstacle to licensing. And we're going to basically, because that was $67 attached onto the licensing fee, look at charging one straight line fee for all of the licenses that are issued, reduce the number of licenses that are issued. And so in doing that, we're looking at the fiscal kind of area, but $45, $50 for all licenses, because now you won't be always paying that fingerprint fee, okay? And this way the commission can go in, as you know, the rules are currently written with several licenses. There's several, some can get licenses for 3 years. Some occupations can only get a license for 1 year. We're hoping to increase that you can all get licenses for 3 years and you can buy them out, because we're looking at trying to alleviate the problems that are related when you're not continuously licensed. For instance, a lot of times the racing office is confronted with a problem when they have a lot of entries on horses that many people are not licensed when they enter that horse. And even, I think licensees will agree, I get that call from the racing office and it's like, oh God, I'm not licensed, I've got to run down and get a license. And that tends to cause a backlog, not just at the racing office for those entries that have to get pulled, but also for our licensing office, which finds itself often inundated with a lot of last-minute requests for license renewals. So we're hoping to also include within these rules, and we've drafted this portion of it, that if you are 30 days outside the expiration of your license, you can renew it for the let's say $45 straight line fee. If you're 60 to 100 days out from your expiration of your license, you'll look at a gradual increase for your licensing fee. And this is to deter the expiration of the license, but to make sure that licensees remain continuously licensed through the term. This way, when they enter a horse into a race, the racing office will not be confronted with all of these issues of people not being licensed and trying to get last-minute licensing set up through the licensing office or through the racing office when they enter those horses. And so it'll be a gradual increase in the fee from a, say, 60 or 120-day period. But this way, people will be continuously licensed and they won't have these issues that they're confronted with the licensing or through the entry process of those horses. Division 5 is specific occupational licenses. I think that this has been discussed at least at Gillespie momentarily, but there are some licenses that we grant through the Racing Commission, and primarily veterinarians comes to mind, the equine dental providers. They have licenses through the State Board of Veterinary Medical Examiners. They've gone through the vetting process, and so we want to basically work on a situation where we have business licenses for those occupations that are already licensed through a primary licensing authority for that occupation at the racetrack. So there'll be some business licenses. We're also hoping to avoid or at least work in situations where we're dealing with the owner-trainer and the transitions of occupations or trainers from one owner or one owner's trainer to another, those transitions to where we can better track that information and potentially even those horses. This is to avoid a problem that's been recurrent through the racing industry with the program trainers. So we're looking at trying to set up business licenses that have those trainers that have had, many have been in the industry for a long time. Many owners have been in the industry with specific trainers, and they can have a business type of license where they would be able to operate under a business license, and we would be able to better document the transactions that occurred through that entry process, et cetera. We've also discussed and are looking at situations of registering vehicles and whether that might be a feasible idea for those that are accessing the backside on a regular basis. The responsibilities of occupational licensees, this I think everybody is most familiar as far as the occupations go of 311-104, which is the trainer responsibilities. We're looking at trying to beef those up, get rid of some that may be kind of best understood. I think that, you know, we have fire prevention, et cetera, and within the trainer responsibility, there's certain fire prevention requirements. Those are certainly feasible, admirable, but in addition, what we've really been working on and what has helped us as far as breakdowns in our state has been the morning training observation. And so some of the instances that we're looking at is whether we can ask trainers to make sure that when the veterinarian wants to call you in for a training exercise or observations that are made out on the training course, that the veterinarian can call you in and we'll get a prompt response so that we can best take care and enable the care of the horse for any lameness issues or anything like that. So there have been some issues, at least in the past, and it's our best efforts that have made the breakdown numbers for our tracks some of the lowest in the country. We find this morning training has been invaluable, but sometimes we find that the exercise rider or whoever may be kind of walking sideways from the veterinarian, and he's like, hello, come back. We want to walk that horse, jog it on the pavement, something like that. So we want to make a responsibility for the trainers to make sure that in those morning trainings, when the veterinarian is contacting them about certain issues that have been observed in a workout or a work, that those are taken care of or communicated from the vet to the trainer or the exercise rider to the trainer. That's kind of an overview of it. I think that what we really wanted to do with today's meeting was set it up so that everybody would have an opportunity to say, this is what I kind of like about some of these rules. This is what I don't like about the rules. I know from personal communications out in the field, there's been some issues, for instance, that have been brought up with the jockey drug testing and so forth. And so they come in and they take a test and they get a marijuana. And then they turn around and say in another jurisdiction, they get another marijuana positive test. Well, the question is, and under our rules as currently written, there's a mandatory revocation of a license. It's pretty clear, although our rules do not say how long a revocation is, that the revocation does not mean a lifetime ban. They can always come back, but there's nothing defined within our rules as to how long a revocation is, okay? And so they can always come back and look at whether or not they could apply and be granted a license again. Some state agencies within the state of Texas have a revocation law that says we'll revoke your license, but it won't be for more than a year. I don't think that that's feasible, but certainly we need to look at whether revocation for jockeys on just across the board for a second test of a marijuana, whether that be in Texas or another jurisdiction, our rule again is not clear, and how long that revocation would be. So we want to look at trying to clarify this for jockeys and for understanding where and what would constitute a licensed disciplinary sanction. And this is in the process of trying to improve the sport and look at it in modernizing those types of licensing issues. So we've talked about criminal eligibility applications, trying to keep continuous licensing for occupational licenses so that we don't get confronted with entry problems, and as well as the testing. And I would be glad to open it to the floor and the commissioner.
And just from the regulatory point of view, a lot of what we're trying to put in place is, indeed, we don't want to create a bunch of administrative barriers that just make too many hoops that people have to jump through. However, we also want to make sure that, the backside of the racetrack is a controlled area. So if people have access to that area or doing business in that area, that we have some way to make sure that indeed we're not letting criminals and so on and so forth. And so this is where having the longer licensing period, but if you come in and tomorrow you plan to run your horse and you're just putting in your application today, and that doesn't give us time to really do a background check, we get the obvious question from the outside, who are you letting on the backside of your racetrack? So we want to try to establish rules that can be attained, are not impediments to people who are truly trying to do business and participate in the sport, but we also don't want to have such a leaky process that, people come and go who really have no business on the racetrack. The other side, and this is where all of these things, sooner or later, if indeed there's violations, they land in the laps of our stewards, and we love our stewards, and we would provide them with a high-tech crystal ball if there was such thing. I haven't found the batteries for mine, and my magic wand doesn't work either. But so many things come at these people in addition to running the races and all the rest. So we want to have regulations that indeed we can make sure that the people who are on the backside of the racetrack are authorized to be there, that we are not letting, toxic, poisonous, criminal elements, dangerous people into the backside. So when we let people on there, you have some assurance that these are folks that belong there, have a legitimate job, and we're not letting, evildoers come in back there. But then when when it does come time to hand down a ruling on someone, we want to make sure that our stewards have got a solid black and white guidance, no surprises. You screwed up, here's your penalty, here's how long it is, and don't come back until boom. And so, we recognize that there's a lot going on the backside on any given day, and, the steward's plate is pretty full, but we want to empower them with clear rules that they don't have to just, put a finger in there or say, what's the point? I can't, why enforce a rule if I really don't have the backing? So, because they're our frontliner, as we say in the military. They're the pointy end of the spear. We want to make sure that we're giving them the kind of tools that they need so that they can provide an environment where we can tend to business and not have the evil things that can happen if indeed you have too loose a regulatory environment.
I'm going to add to that, too. I just want to be clear. We're not removing the fingerprint requirement, but the rules and the act were instituted long before, and our fingerprinting requirements and the laws and the ability to grab those fingerprints and retain them within the Department of Public Safety is something that's, as time and modernization has gone on, and so you don't have to re-fingerprint every time. Those are already recorded and saved, so they'll be run, and the backgrounds will be updated for the criminal histories, et cetera. But in looking at it, there's just no need for everybody to go back and re-fingerprint every year. And so those are checked. It's part of the application process. It'll remain part of the renewal process, but we're hoping to maintain continuous licensure. It's something that has been a problem that's reoccurred through the racing office, contacting the stewards or whoever, up to the time the race, a few hours before, certainly race day, that we have individuals that have not been able to get their license renewed for whatever reason, on the part of the person or the licensing office, whatever that reason is. And it's something that can be alleviated if we try to ensure that people remain continuously licensed. I think people want to stay continuously licensed, at least not have those kinds of matters come up shortly before a race. So that's what we're trying to do with that.
Okay. So does anyone have any comment, or are y'all just overwhelmed?
You might need to fill a cup.
Do you mind coming up here and we'll,
Stand up there.
well, the microphone, so.
You gave me the options.
And we might have you fill out a public comment
Yeah,
card too. Chris, but
this is the first
You're
one of
good.
these I've done, but I'll fill one out.
Good.
Continuous licensing is a great idea, but we don't have continuous racing. Okay. And yes, we have a 12-month, but, a lot of us, like last year, I would have had a big fine because everything got messed up during COVID. My license expired in August. I felt no need to drive over here with no racing. I renewed it in December, but there's going to be times like that. Mm-hmm. And with having people licensed before entries, you just put a big hard one on your biggest races of your year in both breeds. That's where you have your ship-ins. That's where you have your people from out of state. They nominate, they see what the field like, they see what their horse looks like. On the day of entry, they're usually not even here yet, especially if they're coming from Kentucky or Arkansas or California, a good ways away. If you try to put that, are you gonna have a waiver for stakes races? That's gonna be a whole nother kettle of fish. But wanting these people to be not taking entries unless they're not licensed, that's gonna really hurt your big races.
And so
Not to
a
mention-
reciprocity is what you're driving at.
And good luck with that. But I'm saying there's a big problem. It sounds good on paper, but in reality, I think it's gonna hurt more than it's gonna help. And the worst part, it's gonna hurt your biggest races. And there's still a ship culture on overnights. I mean, we're right there with Louisiana as a racing state, Oklahoma. There's guys that are looking at the condition book. Well, there wasn't a race for me up here. Maybe I'll go down to Texas. Well, I'll enter. Ooh, I don't like, never mind. That's not worth $150 worth of gas. But you're not even gonna take, you don't know.
Right.
And if they have to be licensed and go through all the licensing process before they even enter, they're just gonna say to heck with it, we'll wait for one here.
Okay.
Especially on the smaller overnight races, who's gonna invest, time and money if you're not even sure you're going?
Well, and I hear exactly what you're saying. I think that maybe what I'm not been completely clear on is the modernization of licensing, right? And so the hope is that as we work through this process, that we send out postcards or email through notification that your license is getting ready to expire to avoid any type of higher fee. Also, by not having that 67 on the fingerprints, it does save, and we're reducing the overall cost of the license.
Well, we don't get fingerprinted. I think they're good for 5 years or something like
Right,
that. I
right,
mean,
right.
it's not a
And
yearly.
so it's not always, right?
I'm thinking more your bigger problem's gonna be people that aren't licensed to begin with, or somebody that ran a race in Texas 3 years ago. They haven't been back. But now they have a stakes horse, or for whatever reason, they wanna run a race. Be real careful with that you don't eliminate them.
Right.
Because they're not gonna jump through all the hoops. They're not gonna go through the licensing process when they're not even sure if they're gonna enter or run.
Right. And I think that's a good
I
point.
think it's great for the in-house population, but with the ship culture nowadays, you know, with the computers where everybody's got 6 condition books and every owners have 12, it's not quite as feasible. And like your jockeys, you know, they go ahead and enter me on the stakes race, you know, on the stakes day, but then their other 2 horses don't get in, don't go. They get a better race here. They're not coming, but they couldn't be entered on. You know, they've talked about it with the trainer, but they don't want to put the entry in jeopardy because, you know, Mike Smith's hasn't run in Texas, so he wasn't registered here. Just be careful.
Yeah, I hear that. And
It's one thing for the population that's normally Texas. It's another thing on your ship races.
Well, and the reality is that, you know, even though as a state agency, our jurisdiction ends at the state line, the industry is very much an interstate movement on any given day. You know,
Yeah.
stables of any size are highly likely to at least adjoining states, if not
Sure. And like I
regional.
said, I think the biggest harm would come to your biggest races.
Right. Well, and
That's
it's,
when you get the further geographic, you know, you get more geographic movement. And those are the races you can least afford to hurt. Those are your showcase races.
and we're not trying to stop the entry of horses by
No,
that
I don't
check
want
in advance.
the law of
right?
unintended consequences.
Right. I can see what you're saying.
Always try to look ahead to those, because those are the ones that trip you and smack you in the face.
Yeah.
You know,
So-
you know, it's you know, this is another one trying to find the sweet spot, because the other side is if somebody is an absolute bona fide dyed-in-the-wool criminal, but not on our books, they get a big horse, they come in, and then after the fact, we find out,
Right.
oh, why did you let them in? So
Yeah, and you also gotta be careful if a groom comes with the horse.
Right.
The trainer can't, I can't sign for a groom, and, I mean, you have to sign that the groom works for you, but I can't sign his signature. That can be a whole nother, usually when you haul in somewhere with a stakes horse, you unload your horse, you get him settled. If it's nighttime the next morning or later that day, however it works, you haul your kid up and you get him licensed. But just be careful, you know.
The idea is.
Licensing should never be fast and loose. I mean, that should be pretty structured, but don't structure it to the point where you make honest people into criminals or rule breakers because it was impractical for them to do. You know, I've got an owner that's 83 years old. Okay, I still have to handwrite her bills and put them in the mail, and the check comes in the mail. And she hasn't had a horse for a couple years. Her 2-year-old had an accident. I got to get her licensed here this year, and I'm not looking forward to it, guys. And she lives in Temple, so it's not like I can sit at her house and do it. It's going to have to be mail, it's going to have to be early, and we've got a segment of that population that's probably going to be around for another 8 to 10 years in the industry. We cannot go all electronic.
Well,
We've
there
got
are
people that
those.
can.
Yeah, and there are those, that's what we're hoping to try to open up the conversation for, Chris, because we want to be able to modernize at the
Oh,
same
sure.
time and make it convenient for those people that are in Kentucky that have never been licensed in Texas that want to come
Look,
down
my
for the big
mother-in-law is
race.
80, and that woman gets on, she's great. Miss Melva Lou it doesn't happen, okay? She's starting to play with her tablet, but the other day it asked her to sign in again, and she was pretty sure it was gonna charge her, so she said, I'm not doing that. And I said, no, that's not how it works. So, we are not gonna get her licensed online in this lifetime.
Yeah, well, and the
And
hope
there's a
is,
population, we've gotta deal with both for a few years. But my big thing is just the be careful on being licensed before you enter. you're gonna be real careful of the law of unintended consequences, and that's trainers, owners, jockeys, and if help
Well,
comes with the horse.
and the goal is not to sit there and interfere with the entry process.
No.
You know, by having this rule is to try to promote people to try to remain continuously licensed.
Yeah, but if they
Send a
run here once in
notification.
so if a guy runs in the stakes this year and he doesn't have a horse for another 2 years, is he gonna be penalized? Why would he?
Well, he
lives in
wouldn't if he bought a
Kentucky.
3-year license.
Be careful with that. And what if it's 5?
Right.
Again, that they come back. You're dealing with a mobile population.
True.
I really think that this might need a little more thought before we think we've got the answer.
And I would agree. I mean, certainly that's why we really didn't have that draft out today, but we want your input when it comes out.
It's just, again,
I'll send you a
the law of
copy.
unintended consequences.
Yeah, it's just, for us to have jurisdiction on someone, you know, status is everything. So if someone has a license, then indeed, if we need to, you know, call them in for a prayer meeting, we can. If someone does not have a license, then we don't, you know, our hook doesn't catch so well. Okay. Kelly,
Yes, ma'am. Thank you.
welcome.
Thank you for the opportunity to speak today. I'd just kind of like to follow what Chris said. Chris kind of comes from the trainer's perspective, and I would like to maybe just supplement what she said as a consideration from an owner's perspective.
Okay.
Continuous licensing, I think, I get where you're going with it, and I understand what you're trying to accomplish. I'm not sure if continuous licensing is maybe the best way to get that done, and I'll tell you why. I'm a good example. We stopped running at Lone Star in June, and we had no more thoroughbreds running until next January. What, I mean, why do I need to pay for 6 months? Why am I going to be penalized for that? Now, granted, I've already got my license renewed, and I've done that. But I will also tell you, I'm licensed in Florida, Arkansas, Iowa, Minnesota, many states. And Texas is one of the easier states to license with, I will say that. Having gotten my license in multiple states, Texas is one of the easiest states to deal with. The folks in your licensing office at the Racing Commission are just amazing, nice people to work
Best.
with. They really are. And I was able to do a lot of stuff by filling out the forms, printing them, scanning them back in, you know. To Chris's point, I was able to do a lot electronically, but we have a co-owner on a horse that I do all of his paperwork because he's not that tech savvy. And you still have, I think, in our racing population, to Chris's point, you have a sector that's not who they are yet. You know, we've got a big group that's moved that can do it, but we've got a pretty good sector that's not who they are. So I would echo kind of what she said and caution that I just think a continuous licensing application that employs a penalty or a fee, I don't know is a really good way to go. And I would also say, when you say we're removing the fingerprinting fee, you're removing it for you, but we still have to pay to get fingerprinted. We just pay it somewhere else. And I will tell you, I've already had some people this year call and ask me, where do I go get my fingerprints? You know, they still kind of don't understand you have to go find an Identigo or a location that can do it. So now we're back to my sort of challenged group that, you know, I kind of have to help them with. So I would just like for us to consider that as we shepherd our way to modernization, that we don't unintentionally exclude some people or cause some consequences that I think we didn't really foresee encountering.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Kelly, because that's one thing that we want to do is remove the obstacles and barriers to licensing. We really don't want the consequence of making it more difficult, right? The goal is to remove those. So I appreciate that, Kelly. Thank you.
Just to kind of
Scott Sherwood.
Scott Sherwood, TQHA. Just to kind of go on what they were talking about, penalizing someone because they run a horse for a couple of years, they decide to get out of the business for a year, then come back and want to get a license again and run a horse. You're going to run owners. I mean, this isn't like a huge fee, but it's going to make some owners get upset. So the late fee, this whole late fee section, I'd scratch it out of there. That's just my opinion. I mean, I'm one of those guys that I'll run a horse a couple of years, I'll get a baby and it doesn't work out and I won't run. Come back the next year, you're gonna charge me double my license just because my horse didn't work out and I didn't run it, so. Also a question, this year was the first year I had to do my owner's license on paper in God knows how long. Are you gonna get the online licensing back up?
Yes, yes,
Okay.
and the hope is January. but
Okay, if that comes back up, that'll help alleviate a lot of these people's
A
problems.
lot of problems for the agency too. I
Yeah.
agree. So, yes, the hope is, that the
Okay.
database is going to be recovered. So that's what we're hearing. I can't
Perfect.
guarantee anything, but we're looking at January to
Okay.
get licensing back online. And for the Texas Gov,
Right.
and so forth. So, yeah, we're working on that, and it's turned a corner just the last couple of weeks.
Again, just the late fee thing, another example, we're having the Challenge Championship races here at Lone Star next year. You may have had a guy run a horse here a few years ago and then, shipped in for stakes. Now he's coming back for the Challenge Championship, and you're gonna tell that owner, okay, you gotta pay 3 times the license fee because you haven't been licensed in 3 years. So late fees, that's gonna cause more problems than they're worth.
For those blue moon occasions, so like Chris was talking about somebody who's coming in for stakes or that, an emergency license that has got, a little bit more hefty fee and then a heck of a hammer if indeed they perjured themselves. Because again, our only jurisdiction on somebody is,
Sure.
is status. But if somebody's coming in and they say, I'm not interested in a 3-year thing, I just had this horse, my owner said he wanted it, and, we go to Texas once. So, if it's a blue moon licensing or emergency license or anything like that, a shorter term, one time more significant fee, because we have to jump through hoops to make it happen, and then the assurance that we're not letting in, a criminal, then that, has a bigger stick on the back end if they perjured themselves. Is that, I'm kind of looking over here.
You're still gonna be penalizing the people coming in for the biggest races that your state relies on.
I don't, it's not a car payment, unless it's, one of my cars like I went through college, but
Well, but your car, you're still able to drive your car, though.
but I mean, something that, we would
But what
rather
I'm-
you get licensed,
The way I read this thing, where it says a person whose license expired for 90 days or less may renew the license by paying a late renewal fee to 1.5 times renewal fee. Okay, if I have a horse and I'm running it, and then it gets hurt or whatever, and my license happens to expire the next month, and I'm waiting until my yearling comes up and ready to run as a 2-year-old, and then I go ahead and get my license then, I'm gonna get penalized for that. And that's a bad road to go down.
Yeah, I hear your point, and I understand it because of the seasonal effects of racing, right? Versus like driving a car.
Well, not just seasonal, I mean, it could be, a person could be, well, this year I'm not gonna run a horse, I can't afford it. Or
Right.
the 2 horses I bought at the sale didn't work out, so I don't need to get me a license. And they go buy 2 more the next year, and they're ready to go get their license, and instead of paying their normal $50 fee, they gotta pay $150 according to this thing.
Right,
'cause they're
right.
without
Well,
license for 2 years.
this is the whole point of putting like a draft out there, is so that everybody can start with this and stuff like
Sure.
that. And so, maybe 90 days isn't the idea, maybe 6 months later, or something, but to try to keep it continuous. Next. But when Scott's not, I didn't mean to push you off, Scott. Oh,
One
okay.
thing Chris and I were just saying, to kind of
Okay, Kelly, yeah.
to kind of mediate between what you were saying and what Chris was saying, what if you did like, and this is just a suggestion, but what if you did like a temporary license, like you said, that's more of an immediate license, but it's just for the duration of that meet?
Right.
So like, you've got an owner, so Steve Asmussen has an owner coming in from Kentucky for a stakes race in March, right, here at Lone Star, or April. And he's got another, that same owner's gonna send another horse in for a big race at the end of June. What if you could grant that license for just the duration of that meet only at that track? So just for the period of Lone Star.
And it might not even be that meet. I mean, if we allow for, temporary licenses, and, is it owners? I mean, is it trainers, is it,
Well, and actually, the Racing Act does have a provision for a temporary license, and it's not relegated to the particular occupation and so forth. The problem that, and it's not necessarily a problem, but the problem is, again, just, we would like to see licensees that can stay within the realms of the rules and follow those rules. And so you have a licensee and you obtain your license, and then we say we're going to consider continuing education or those kinds of things. So you want to look at whether or not somebody's doing it for the purposes of coming in and may not race on a regular basis in the jurisdiction, but those that also, we have to contemplate those that also are within, Texas and race on a continuing basis. And
What
so-
about somebody that's licensed in other jurisdictions already coming in for a stakes race? It would be different than someone who appears out of the ether and is entering. I mean, there's, maybe make a clause in there.
Chris, can you come up to the microphone, please?
We just got to have you on tape.
Well, we don't want to lose this for
I was just saying,
posterity.
It's a good point.
Maybe put a clause in there for pre-existence licensing. Again, you can't call it reciprocity unless you
Go through
have all
the
the channels with the other states.
multi-jurisdictional
Yeah, it
agreements.
gets, people get funny, but just being licensed in another jurisdiction or multiple jurisdictions when they're coming in for a race or a weekend or,
Yeah.
then they're not held to the same, where you're gonna penalize them if it's 14 months before they come back for another race, or maybe they don't come back for 2 years, they're not having to pay double, or like you said, Scott said, if the horse don't have one. But my big thing on the continuity of licensing and having them licensed further out is again, the stakes races. But these people coming in for these races usually have a history and a record somewhere else,
Right.
which is a lot different than John Smith, who suddenly shows up with a horse for a race.
You've
And has
never seen him on a horse or with a
Never been
horse.
licensed anywhere before. And I'm thinking to get more the owners than the trainers. But it's the owners that if you piss off, they won't come back. And they'll tell all their owner friends, there's other races, you don't want to go to Texas because it's a hassle. Because that's what they used to say in Chicago about Minnesota.
Mindy, Mindy Coleman, can you hear me?
She might be
Turn
mute.
on your microphone.
Yes, sorry.
Jockeys have opportunities to move around. Do you have some thoughts on this?
Yeah, a little twofold. Yes, they do. But with that being said, I think I would reiterate some of the things that have been said. There's been changes too. I mean, so a jock may be licensed in one jurisdiction, racing in another jurisdiction. He may not, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Oh, I thought somebody else was coming, sorry. As far as like the continual license, it may be the same thing. They go where their business is, so they may go away for 2 years and then come back to Texas. The second part with them moving, we have 1 and 3 year licenses depending on the jurisdiction, but they need to be, I think that they still need to disclose to you guys any violations that are out of the ordinary, any updates that they have on their licensing applications too.
Okay, thank you very
I
much.
don't know if that was directly what you were asking, sorry, but that was part of it. And then the other thing, I guess, is kind of goes back to what I was doing during the presentation of what it takes to be licensed as a jockey and or an apprentice jockey. And I think that needs to be included in this area under licensing of requirements, not just the physical exams and those, but the actual requirements of the ability to be a jockey and an apprentice driver.
Mindy, can I get some clarification on what you said earlier about that? Because you talked about a system and, of course, we've got HIPAA laws and all of that as far as like baseline assessments of jockeys and so forth. And it seemed like you alluded to maybe a centralized database of that information. I mean, is that feasible, or is it really within the realms, or should it remain within the realms of the respective jurisdictions? And how is that as far as like, barrier to licensing for jockeys to get baseline assessments from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, perhaps?
I'll answer that twofold. So In the past and up until very recently, the Guild has been a proponent of having the centralized database, again, using the Jockey Health Information System. It was one aspect of the RTO, or the Racetrack Operation System, that is used in virtually all the racetracks throughout the country. The Jockey Health Information System was one in which the jockeys agreed to put their information in, and that had their previous medical history, emergency contact information, and any existing medications that were in there. And then for a brief period, we tried to do, along with the Jockey Club, doing initial baseline tests that were done under the impact. This has been 6 or 7 years ago. They stored that information in there. And the reason that was beneficial is Texas actually is, well, I should say, Sam Houston, there were racetracks in Texas that were very adamant about having your annual physicals with you and enforcing that, even though that's a requirement at a lot of jurisdictions. Texas and West Virginia were two of the jurisdictions that were adamant in enforcing that. And it was beneficial to have it in a centralized, so that the jockey didn't have to carry that physical with them. With regards to what you're asking now, unfortunately, there's been a lot of changes because I can't give you any definite answers. The new medical director just took his position on a week ago Friday. I believe that that's something that's being discussed as far as a centralized database to have that information. Regardless of a member of HISA or not, I believe Texas could still have access to that, those databases. There's some different ones that they're looking at. I don't want to speak out of term as far as what they've decided to do. And then the other thing, I think that the one that exists would have been beneficial. The problem is the increases in levels of security that were necessary for databases storing health information. Since I was originally created in, I believe, 2008 or 9, they haven't taken the necessary steps to update that level of security as required, and that's one of the reasons we haven't been as supportive of going through that process, even though it is, or using that database, even though it's currently still in existence.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, I might have said HISA, but I meant HIPAA, you know, and again, I think that there's probably some problems with that centralized database relative with the updates from 2008, 2009, and privacy of individuals' medical records, right, and access to those bases.
Correct. I think that the one thing, though, where a lot of racetracks and people were not willing to participate in at that time, even when it was up to date, they were using HIPAA as a reason for doing so. However, HIPAA wouldn't, it was the jockeys who were voluntarily putting that information in there as a stored database. Now there's the protections of the medical records, which is separate from the HIPAA and actually what HIPAA applies to. The jockeys were voluntarily storing that information and signed a waiver acknowledging that that information would be used, one, to verify for their licensing, and then two, by the medical providers at the racetrack to then provide that information in the event that the jockey is unconscious or able to communicate his medical history once transported to a racetrack.
Yeah, that's extremely
and we
beneficial.
got off a little bit once you were going into licensing, but that was the premise of those centralized databases.
Yeah.
Right, we want to make sure that indeed we don't become the soft spot, so if people are hurt or can't race someplace else because they've had some kind of injury and they got their bell rung and have neurologic things, but if Texas isn't testing, they'll come here. We want to make sure that we're not the soft spot and attract people who really, for their own health and their own good, should, you know, stand down for a period of time.
Well, and looking at the modernization, I mean, I don't know how much it really took off or it was, but I think there were virtual wallets, right, when we first started getting COVID vaccinations and stuff. And maybe there's looking at some sort of situation where the jockeys can maintain their own records, but provide those in the event that there is an injury or something via a phone app, or I don't know. I mean, it's just looking at that modernization of those, the ability to maintain their privacy to their medical information while at the same time being able to care for that person in an extension or emergency circumstances.
I think, you know,
And we've looked at some of those are the apps like HeadCheck and some of the others. The problem with that is a lot of times when the jockey is injured and he's transported, he doesn't have anything with him. One of the responses to that was obviously doing the medical cards. The problem is with that, the vests and a lot of the stuff is cut off for the jockeys by the time they've arrived to the hospital. So there was some delay with the consideration of that because a lot of times the valet or somebody else will bring that, but it's at a significantly later time before they can get into that individual, which is part of the reason with this database, the designated medical provider at the racetrack would have access to that. And again, this goes back to having the lines of communication for the racetrack, send that directly to the medical facility where they know the jockey's being transported, so they have that at least initial information.
And that goes back to the racetrack licensing provisions and looking at to whether or not we should actually facilitate through having a medical director or more medical staff.
I think
Thank you, Mindy.
this is deep water. We're going to have to do a lot of swimming, but we might need any.
Sorry, that's
No.
all the different rules, and I know we're trying to do just on licensing on 304, but I apologize.
No, I mean, all of this is very
They're
important. but-
intertwined.
Yeah, but I think we've got a lot of very deep water to swim through. But what people are saying, thank you very much, because you're providing an essential input for where we sit, working in an office and trying to work in Texas.gov. Okay, what works best within that framework as if we're licensing plumbers, and we're not. We have to find what works for the industry.
Yeah, come forward, please. We'll have you fill out a public comment card here shortly.
Name, please.
Hello, Liberty LeBrun here.
Welcome.
I just wanted to let you guys know that with my company and the background checks that we have to go through, you guys are part of the Texas Commission and stuff, so go to the TALCB, which is the Texas Appraisal Licensing Commission Board, and they do background checks in 24 to 48 hours. For us, and so maybe if you guys can correlate or somehow get with them or whoever's running that and check their process out, because with a week entry, we have about a week entry, you would be able to do a decent background check, and if there's somebody coming in just for a stake or something, they could always give you the information for their groom or whoever they're bringing in as well.
Good point, Liberty. We're actually looking into that, too.
Okay.
It's a real good point, though. Yeah.
I just wanted to let
We
you know.
are.
That's
Yeah.
valuable.
Well,
Thank
and
you.
it's actually a better process, and that's what we're working to do, is try to streamline and make it more efficient for licensing overall. So,
Right.
good point, though, and we are looking.
I'll get with Mary. I have some ideas on the continuing education because I have to do them every 24 months.
Okay.
And it's all online. It's super easy. So I have an individual that does my IT development, and so maybe we could get together and come up with a real easy way for everybody, for the jockeys and the trainers. I'm not sure that it'd be important really for the owners, because they're relying on their trainer to know all the information.
Right.
So I just thought I'd bring that up as well.
Yeah, great point, and we appreciate it, yeah.
You're
That'd be
welcome.
great.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Ready to move on?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. All right. Any other comments on 304? Okay. Agenda item 3C, 306, outline on new chapter 306, health and safety. Mary?
Mary's ready to go.
This
She's
is
out of the gate early.
304, I'm sorry.
Oh, 304, okay.
Yes, just two items I had a question about. This is draft rule 304.303, access to examinations. It says, upon request, examinations may be offered in a foreign language at the expense of the requester. I firmly believe there should not be a charge for this.
Okay, and, yeah, and so that's a good point.
Okay. The other thing has to do with the trainer's test. It's Section 20, Trainers Examinations, paragraph B. This is on page 159, sorry.
Wait, Mary, you actually got a copy of the rough draft
Okay.
304 that got pulled because it's like, yeah,
All
really
right.
rough. But
It's talking about the written examination. If they fail the written examination, they cannot take it again before 90 days. And then an applicant who fails the written exam for a second or any subsequent time may not schedule the written exam for 180 days. And after, so on and so forth, after they finish their written exam, finally pass it, they have 365 calendar days to do the practical. That's great on the written and the practical. I have a question, and I have no knowledge at all of what constitutes a trainer's test, but it would seem to me these large periods of time between testing could be problematic, particularly with our short race meets. And I speak from a little bit of experience on this because last year, or perhaps it was the year before, I've lost track now, I was trying to help one of my members who was trying to get a trainer examination for a Hispanic gentleman that wanted to be an assistant trainer. And there was nothing in Spanish for him, and there was no translator available. The problem is, he couldn't get his license for a fair amount of time. The other point that I want to make with this is perhaps you should consider a retesting schedule that's based upon the percentage of answers that were incorrect. In other words, if a person doesn't qualify by passing the written exam by one question, they ought to be able to retake that exam quicker than a person who got every test answer wrong. The other point to that is a lot of people have test anxiety. They know the material, but they have a test anxiety issue that causes them to fail perhaps the first time, maybe the second time. But then they get comfortable enough with the process where they could do it the third time. But I think, without any parameters on this is just excessively prohibitive. If they have to wait this long, they may say, forget it, I'm not going to do it. So that's all.
I think that's a good point. And again, Sunset directed us to kind of remove these barriers to licensing and not providing examinations, applications, and some of this information in other languages is a barrier to licensing. There has been, I forget now if it was a House bill or Senate bill, but by 2023, all state agencies will be required to have all their law and rules online in both English and Spanish. And so in that regard, we're making that transition. We've got a great new multimedia specialist here running our camera today. I hope it makes me look better. But Leonard is working as well on providing some educational videos on the Texas Racing Commission YouTube site that will provide how to get a license in both English and Spanish. It'll describe situations that occur on the backside. You have a winning horse, how that works with the chain of custody and sample collection.
Right.
Perhaps even stewards' hearings and how you respond to a notice of alleged violation and so forth if you want a hearing. So we're hoping to provide more educational stuff. So I really appreciate these points. I don't know that we did a lot of revision on the trainer's exam portion of the rule. As you recited it back to me, I'm not sure that there are a lot of changes that we threw in there. Right. But I agree that sometimes perhaps these gaps between taking the exam the first time and studying for it and then having a, i.e. layoff period and re-examining. And certainly as part of those comments and so forth, which I'm taking notes, we'll have this on video, is looking at a reduction of those current rule days. And whether there's a consensus there and what that recommendation would be. Right. Turning around, I think in the real estate exam, you can take the exam and turn around and come back in.
What was probably driving a fair bit of that is it used to be we only paid stewards on race days. So a lot of the funding and how we pay for our staff and everything else. So if you're only paying for stewards on race days, they're busy people. And
Right.
so if somebody's coming at them, every other week, they're just like, look, we got a lot of other fish to fry. So a whole lot of what we are working on, and certainly, we're hoping for for the sun to come up and a whole new process. Because if we're going to provide effective regulatory, not only the negative part, but also the administrative support piece, we have to be able to have qualified people who have more availability, because it got down to where our stewards, to try to work a race day, working with a racing office and do their race card, and then there might be 2 or 3 hearings. There's only so many minutes in a day, and, all of them are superhuman, but they even get tired after a while. And then they, when they're not getting paid, they're not much interested in coming back to the racetrack for free to give these things. So, what you're saying is important, making sure, because, we have a fair number of people that, perhaps their reading skills are not the best, but it doesn't mean that they couldn't pass a trainer's test. So there are workarounds, but a lot of it gets to staff and resourcing. So number one, hopefully we will have a benevolent legislative opportunity to change how the agency is funded so we can more effectively support the industry. But then, take a look at these things. So what you're saying, points well made, but I think just, as was said before, look back at some of the old things. How did we get here? It was because there's just only so many minutes in the day, and if somebody just can't get it, they got shuffled to the back and bigger fish got fried. So we're hoping to be able to do better.
Right.
It's way past time to fix some of these problems, in particular the trainer's exam being in Spanish. I mean, it's way past time. And as we look at the allocation of resources and setting up the policies and procedures and trying to streamline that examination process for the stewards, as well as like hearings, their real job is to watch those films and watch those races and make sure that everybody's safe. But we have to discipline licensees. We have to get these people licensed, and a large part of what the stewards do is their jobs as well, is to clear those that have questionable, say, i.e. backgrounds, if it's not the investigator. So part of the policies and procedures that we work in placing, all of this is raising all those issues that have come up in the past repeatedly, but need to be resolved as we move through these rules and revise them.
Right, I agree. I think it just struck me on the length of time between testing. One size does not fit all, and I think, they should be assessed the additional time to study based on their particular results to their test.
Thank you, Mary.
Thank you.
Point well taken. Okay, are we ready to
I
move
think we
on
got one more
to
comment from Liberty.
304?
again.
Okay.
I just want to help add on with Mary. So with the TALCB, that commission, the Texas Regulated Commission, they have an online exam that we could put together. And then there's proctor places like Pearson View, which is in the DFW area. And I think there's a Pearson View in Houston, and then there's another proctor area in San Antonio where we could do that. We wouldn't have to rely on the stewards. They would have to, of course, have to pay, like it's $50 to go in there to pay, but for their own convenience, and then you could get it in English or Spanish. It would be on a computer, and say they'll give them like a 4-hour or 2-hour time period. We need to figure out how long it would take for us to do it. But if you could put together something like that, I think it would be easier. And also with the TALCB, we get 3 shots to take the test. So, and then you have to take the class all over again.
Yeah, that's kind of the purpose behind the reexamination, and I think the delays. We checked on one proctor exam, because I agree. I think it would really be great if we could take it away from the stewards. And not only that, but, the stewards' time is not necessarily within the exams themselves, but it is watching, right? I mean, and
Right.
making sure that we have somebody that's
Right.
not cheating on an exam. Now, a
Right.
majority of people are not going to do that, but you have those few, right, that are going to sneak in with the notes and written on their sleeves and so forth. And so I'd like to talk to you more about the proctors, because the problem we've run into as the Racing Commission in finding somebody to proctor our exams is that we may give 30, 100 exams in a year.
Right.
And what we found, and I didn't talk to Pearson, is that what?
Pearson View, yes.
Pearson View.
They're very, very
Okay.
strict.
And I can't remember the name of the ones that we checked into, but they wanted a certain number of exams, and they were looking at like 20,000. And they turned us away at the door for even considering a procurement along
Well,
that
I know
line.
the appraisal industry does not do 20,000 a year. They're begging for appraisers.
Okay, so Pearson View, Liberty, I appreciate that.
You're welcome.
And let's talk some more about that, because I would appreciate that. I think that it would be, because again, too, a lot of what the problem has been for trainers' exams and being an obstacle is that the trainers' exams are administered on racetracks, and not everybody lives in Grand Prairie,
That's
right?
true.
And so they have to find the time and the resources to get a hotel or whatever they're gonna do to prepare and come in for the exam. Now, the practical exam is a different kind of animal, and there's a veterinary practical and a steward practical, because we want you to know the parts of a horse, right?
Right.
And so that's kind of a different thing, but I think that if we could alleviate the 100, question exam portion where somebody comes in, it would help people facilitate licensure, right? And so, but yeah, I've run into some problems with proctors, but I've not talked to Pearson View. I want to talk to you more about that.
There's some law offices as well that are certified proctors, and we could always contract them out.
Yeah, in looking at that, that's a situation that I hadn't really just, figured on, but the proctor position, whether it's a law office and getting it too scattered out, but something like a proctor situation that's located throughout the state, I think it would make it much more convenient for trainers, and they'd be a lot happier if they didn't necessarily have to go to the track when the track was active, right? Because we just don't have
Right.
stewards on site when it's dark, so that's a great idea, and I appreciate that. We have looked into proctors, but hadn't been successful with that, so thank you very much. I like the additional
welcome.
names. We'll talk.
Okay.
Okay. Anyone else for 304? Okay, 306. Outline on chapter 306, health and safety. Virginia?
Yes, ma'am. Well, I'm going to run through. The outline is on your agenda. Again, we've not really, got like a really rough draft on this, and a lot of it was precipitated by looking at racetrack safety and the Racing Commission taking on those responsibilities of doing those inspections, informing racing participants and the racetrack associations as to what we were looking for as far as protecting the participants and the safety of the racetracks themselves. And so we want to, as part of those policies and procedures that the commission will be approving, et cetera, is going to be inspection reports. We'll work through some of the policies on the internal and figure out those inspections and what should be a fine assessed if a racetrack fails to correct a certain deficiency. We always, as part of a due process situation, because a racetrack can ask for a hearing if in fact they want to dispute the fact that, we say something is incorrect and they're like, no, that's not deficient, that's fine, da. When we get through that process, but assessing a penalty would entitle them to their due process right to have a hearing, right? So we want to give everybody a time to cure and look at that, but we want to make sure it's sufficiently before racing starts to take place. We don't want to convolute the process of opening up for race day. So that gets into the horse inspections and monitoring and so forth. This is something that has been brought up even through HISA, but it's more of your pre-race examinations, horse monitoring. This deals with the shockwave therapy treatments and making sure that those get on the vet list and that we have clear and concise communication between the veterinarians and the horse people, the horsemen. Racetrack monitoring and maintenance. Again, this goes into the inspection process. I think it was rather convoluted. It was very difficult and somewhat chaotic on inspections for racetracks, when those were going to occur, what happened when problems came up, and what happened once the racetrack came open for the season and those deficiencies were not corrected. Because then it becomes even bigger problems for opening day, and it kind of collides into other problems. One problem, it's much like a water problem. You see the water dripping from one spot, but there's a bigger puddle back over here. So we want to make sure that it doesn't become a chaotic process, but that it is more streamlined, flowed, and then when opening day occurs, there aren't these problems that precipitate as a result of a deficiency. Emergency preparedness. Mindy had mentioned this earlier on in the game and the warning systems, and we do think that a rule might be a good idea for the warning systems and the lights and the noises that occur. And the only reason why is, again, for consistency among racetracks. You may have the flashing lights for a loose horse, and another track may have the sirens, right? And so we want to have a consistent from racetrack to racetrack what those warning systems are for each type of emergency situation that arises on the tracks. And that when a horseman or a participant moves from one track to another, they understand that the flashing lights means a loose horse, or the siren means, and that everybody is doing the same type of emergency preparedness for there. We recently updated the hazardous weather rule, but it's always a good idea to kind of review those situations, in particular when we have storms that are coming up rather rapidly or more rapidly than have in the past. Safety training and continuing education. This is not necessarily continuing education, and safety training may fall more under our continuing education, but we really haven't had a lot as far as continuing education for racing participants, and we're really looking for a lot more feedback as to making it safe overall, and whether that should go under licensure or it should fall under the safety of the racetrack. And as we look at it more and more, this may actually move out under occupational licensing and making sure that everybody understands what the safety protocols. For instance, that a jockey understands safety protocols, they need to have a baseline assessment, they need this and this and this for their licensing, and that they keep that updated. Jockey health. This is just kind of again, kind of looking at the drug and alcohol testing. It was in occupational, and we're thinking about moving it under the health and safety. So that goes to jockey health. Specific requirements for racetrack safety and health. This goes into chase ambulances and those kinds of requirements on the track that Commissioner McNabb alluded to earlier, as well as Mindy. The racehorse treatment history and records. With the advent of HISA and other jurisdictions kind of protruding, California's had a long history of providing diagnosis. So we're looking more into not just prohibited substances, but prohibited methods of treatment, right? There are longstanding issues with regard to thyroxine and whether there's a sufficient diagnosis or documented diagnosis of a horse that may require the use of thyroxine. So we're looking at, in this particular racehorse history and treatment records, providing our veterinarians and attending veterinarians a communication line where the health and safety of the horse is paramount and all parties understand the condition of the horse, including the trainers. Claiming races. This is where Marcia brought this up earlier, but we're definitely looking at changing our claiming rule. A lot have moved to the voided claim. That's not the case as it is in Texas, as many of you horsemen here are aware. But certainly we're looking at other jurisdictions. Arkansas's claiming rule has come up as a potential good template to begin to look at the claiming and voided claiming rule. So this will be coming up here shortly in January. We'll put it out on the table. We expect public comment to be quite fruitful. Prohibited practices and requirements for the health and safety of the horses. Again, this goes in with the treatment records and that communication with the vets, the trainers, attending and commission vets. And then the requirements for health and safety of the jockeys. This is just something that we want the jockeys to understand. The types of vests, the types of helmets, and so forth would be listed under this, as well as just perhaps even the crop rule be falling under this. Operation of racetracks. This is a transition from the operation of racetracks under 309. So basically we'll be shifting a lot of that. The operation of racetracks would involve the commission offices that are required at racetracks, the test barn facility requirements, holding barns, receiving barns, all those requirements of racetrack facilities to properly operate and protect the health and safety of the racing participants. Also, the operation of racetracks would go into the dwelling environments for the grooms and jockeys. and that falls into facilities and equipment. So it'll be further defined through the facilities and equipment. You may look at those concession areas and other areas within the racetracks and so forth, but not really expounding. I feel like, and there may be objection to this, but I've looked at other racing jurisdictions, and it seems like the facilities have been pretty well fleshed out. So a lot of this is just movement from the current Chapter 309 into operations and facilities for racetracks. There may be some modernization of those requirements, but certainly there's not anticipated to be a lot of change from the current rules in 309. And we'll open the floor if you'd like, Commissioner.
And really, the last two, operation of racetracks and facilities and equipment, a lot of that was some of our discussion earlier. What does a Class 1 track have? You want to make sure that indeed you have sufficient bathrooms available to the public and that they can have food that's available and so forth. So those things really do make a difference. If you're going to have people come to the racetrack, they want to be able to know that they're not going to get food poisoning, or they're going to spend the day. Physiology takes a hold sometimes, and you want to make sure that you have things that are accessible so people can be comfortable and happy and healthy and safe.
And I will interject one more time on that. In the January meeting that we'll have coming up, Mindy's going to be providing us information from the Jockeys Guild on concussion requirements and those updated rules that they have. We'll be looking at the crop rules, et cetera. So we'll be supplying that information that's provided to the Jockey Guild as part of your meeting materials on the January rules review meeting. We'll also have Mindy back, hopefully in person, that can take more questions as we can give you documentation from which to feed on drafts, et cetera. And everybody always remember they're drafts, but we want to work through to find a good product that's amenable to everybody and ensures the health and safety of all the participants.
Okay. So do we have anyone who'd like to make comments on any of these topics?
Something real quick.
Scott
Sure.
Sherwood, welcome.
Real quick.
Okay.
Scott Sherwood, TQHA. On the claiming stuff, I'm not talking about voiding claims. Get that right there in front,
I got
because
it.
I know
I
that's
got it.
not something you
Don't
want
want the hair on the back of.
No, we're moving. It might be
There's been a lot of
glacial.
talk, especially with the quarter horse guys, about being able to check a box on the claim card that gets the horse tested by the commission, not
Right.
by them, but they pay for it.
Right.
So that if a person does get a bad hair test from that claim, they're still stuck with a horse, but at least the guy got in trouble. That's going to be a deterrent from somebody dropping horses in there.
And they know how to manage the horse without having to.
So my question is with Virginia's legal mind, do we need to, or do y'all need to get some kind of a ruling from the Attorney General saying that, I mean, this is kind of a third party paying for the test?
A third party paying for the test on the, like the climb?
You're running a horse,
Yeah,
I
what-
claim the horse, I'm marking on the box that I want that horse tested. The racing commission, or the stewards are not saying they want the horse tested. The racetrack who pays for the test is not paying for it because the money will come out of the horseman's account to an account that Marcia would set up and then send that back to the track. Does that need to be flushed out to where that's legal to do that?
Yeah, any rulemaking, a rule is anything that affects the substantive rights of a licensee. So when I take your money, I'm affecting your rights.
Okay,
And
so what I'm getting at is, should we get an opinion on that before we go through the,
I think
Jump
we
through the
should
hoops.
definitely look at it being part of the rule or part of an upcoming claim rule. It's going to have to, because it does affect your substantive rights. So I don't think that we necessarily need an AG opinion, because any action taken by the agency or any, requirement that somebody pay, or it's affecting your substantive rights, and we have to put it through the public.
because right now, a
comment.
guy claims a horse, he pays for his own test, the test comes back bad, he's stuck with a horse, which of course he would be anyway, but the guy that ran the horse doesn't get in any trouble. If you check the box and the commission tests it and it comes back bad, then you can run it just like it was
Yes, no, we could.
one that y'all called for.
Right.
Right.
So that's-
And you understand how our current claiming rule reads. I mean, so you claim that horse?
You're
it's
stuck
yours.
with it, yeah.
Right,
You're
that's
gonna
right.
have the horse, but at least that guy that ran it and had albuterol in him is gonna get in trouble.
So but if somebody walks in a claiming race and all of a sudden sees this box and so forth, we'd have to put that through the rulemaking process where everybody is aware and we
Right.
post and.
It requires a new rule, but I mean, talking this through, it's just because the trainer is saying, if I am the successful claimant, then the money to reimburse the state for this extra test, because this would be a hair test
Or the
other
person
than what
paid
the
for it.
stewards had already ordered.
Yeah.
Is it okay that, because the results from the test are going to come through as a state test.
Right.
To land on the steward's desk and action be taken that this horse competed illegally because it had this in a
It's
system.
much like a split sample.
But
Somebody-
paid for by,
The
a
person who
withdrawal
claimed the horse.
from the horseman's account.
Yeah, I don't think that there's a problem, because again, if the box is checked, right, there's a lot of communication between, say, the test barn and the steward's office where that claim card comes, right? So I don't think that there's a lot of problem with the chain of custody or anything like that. And the payment is, again, not necessarily a problem, because much like split samples, right? Those are paid by
Well, I mean,
the
it'd be,
trainer.
you'd have to have the money in your horseman's account.
Right, or,
Pretty
yes.
simple.
But the stewards, when the stewards see, oh, this is a claim, the
Well,
box is
whoever
checked, the
calls it-
stewards just say.
Excuse me, whoever
and-
calls the claim up says,
Right.
this horse is claimed by this person.
Right.
This is the trainer, the box is checked.
But you're
Right.
gonna have to be careful when you sit down, because you got Dennis Seidner, the steward, sitting behind you, so. he
All
may-
Steiner's gotta do is call down and say, send him to the test book.
But it's just that the
And then it would
stewards send the
also,
horse.
it would also allow for the stewards to tell the person who claimed the horse, once the hair test came back clean, hey, that horse did test clean. So the new person knows he's not in any jeopardy of getting a
Right,
bad test
but,
because the test
you
came
know,
back
you'll
clean.
recognize from the HISA problems, right, of getting the horse back and who takes care of that horse while that test is
Well, I mean, you own the
pending.
horse no matter what happens.
No.
Yeah.
Bad test, good test, bad test, too bad. You either get to run him or you gotta send him home for
Oh, I
6
see
months.
where you're going.
But this is, that horse is sent by the stewards who are looking at the claim slip with the box check, so they say, okay, here's 1 and 2, and oh, by the way, 5 goes to the test barn.
Yeah, they're testing him just like he was a random test that they
Right.
already called for.
But then, in the process, then the money comes out of the successful
claimed the horse.
claimer's
Right.
horseman's account.
Yeah.
So it's
I
no
don't
surprise
see
to
a-
him.
I don't see a problem other than we cannot effectuate that prior to a rule being implemented and effective.
Right, sure.
Right,
I'm going to join him because we're joined.
okay, well, I love all the excitement. We're starting to get a crowd at
Yeah.
the podium now.
There's one more step that will have to take place in this process.
Okay.
The tracks pay for the testing now.
Right.
So we would have to have an agreement with the racetracks that they're going to get the bill for this hair testing that this trainer has agreed to pay for. So
Right.
we'd have to have an agreement with the tracks that the horseman's organization is going to pay for that. But now, before a horse is claimed, the stewards check with the horseman's bookkeeper to make sure that that owner has sufficient money in their account to cover the cost of the claim prior to the claim going through. And in the case of a quarter horse, they also have to have a sufficient amount of money in their account to pay for the transfer of the ownership with
Right.
AQHA.
Okay.
So there would just need to be one more check when the stewards verify the claim amount is available. They would have to also verify that the amount of the cost of the testing was also
In that
in that
account.
horseman's account at the time that that claim was dropped.
And that the
So-
money is transferred to the track.
Right.
Yeah,
So
as
before that
restricted
claim,
funds to
before
pay
that
for that
claim can
test.
be allowed to go through. So when the stewards contact the horseman's bookkeeper and say, John Doe has dropped a claim for $25,000, please verify that he has sufficient funds in his account. It's also gonna have to come in and say, he's also checked the claim box, so there needs to be, $15,000, whatever, $240 or whatever the cost of that testing is.
And the track needs to have notification, Joe Joe
But you
Schmo
said
owes
if he claims
you
a
X
$25,000
month.
horse, you just said 15,000. I want to get
But,
him.
but these processes, these processes, although certainly effectuate that process, it doesn't necessarily add any new thing. I mean, you've always got the steward's check in the horseman's account, right? For the sufficient funds and stuff like that. So it doesn't seem that it adds a lot more
It
of
doesn't. It's the same
obligation.
conversation. They just need to make sure that if that box is checked, they say to
And
the
can you
horseman's
void it?
bookkeeper, does he have the cost of the claim and the testing?
And-
Can you
and-
void a test if he doesn't have the testing money in there?
Yeah, can you avoid the claim if there's not a
If
testing?
if.
Say it's a
if-
$25,000 claim, and he's got $25,050 in there, because that's what it takes to do the transfer, and he checks the box, and all he's got is $25,050, and say the test is 150.
Well, the test
Do
is
you
gonna
void-
get run and he's on the hook and there's a financial
Well,
responsibility
not necessarily,
thing that he's gonna.
because would it void the claim because he didn't have the 150 in
Well,
there?
I wouldn't understand.
they're checking before they run
why
the
a
race.
horseman would check the box and not have the money in if he's gonna pay
Well,
25
Then
on a
it
horse.
puts the horseman's organization in the role of a.
I know. I wouldn't understand
I
it,
would,
but
I would
know
tend to
it'll
not
happen.
void the claim, but the stewards and and the trainer who
Make sure he
check the
gets his
box
150,
without the money
yeah.
would certainly have something
We'll
to
cross
talk
that
about.
bridge.
We'll leave that on the steward's
I don't think you
table
void the
there.
claim.
No, then it becomes
Dennis.
making the horseman's bookkeeper, the horseman's organization, debt collectors, and we've got to go chase them down. Because if we have an agreement with the racetrack that we're going to pay for the testing for the horses that have checked the box, and this guy
You're on
went
the hook.
through, then we're on the hook for paying the track. And so then we've got to chase our.
Well, I
people
would
down.
assume though, if there's insufficient monies overall,
So,
then-
My whole point was, if you think we needed any kind of as long as it's in the rule, then we don't need an agreement that a third party, or a ruling that a third party is paying for the test so someone doesn't fight it in court. Because they're gonna get a bad test, you're gonna suspend them and fine them and stuff. Is that gonna be grounds for them to appeal? Because
well,
Scott Sherwood paid for the test.
nothing stops an appeal when you're trying to influence the outcome of a race by using a prohibited
Well,
substance in a
I'm just saying.
racehorse, right?
After the fact,
So
no.
they've all got their due process right, so I don't think that that's gonna, I mean,
Okay.
it'll follow the normal
This
course.
is going to need some more discussion.
Yes, ma'am.
We're planning on having more
Check box,
meetings. Yeah.
Because the more I'm thinking about it, you
Talk
know,
to the
it
mic.
does.
Talk to the mic.
It does place the horseman's bookkeeper in the role of collecting money from the horseman that we've promised the tracks we're gonna pay. So it might have to be, well, the box is checked, but he doesn't have any money, uncheck the box. I don't know. But we don't want the box to be checked. The horse goes to the test barn and gets tested, and then the track comes to the horseman's organization for the fee, and that guy, got tested and he didn't have the money in his account. So hopefully when we tell the stewards, no, he does not have that money for the testing, that there'll be a step 3 there that, what's the remedy for that?
Right,
So that's
right.
something we need to think about before we
Okay,
go too far.
fair enough. Okay, anyone else? Anything else? Okay, at this time, we will now welcome public comment on any of the matters. If you haven't turned in a card, if you have spoken at the microphone, please, and not filled out a card, please do so, just so we can keep track of who all our great input is, because, we might be reaching back for more elaboration. The next opportunity for public comment is the Texas Racing Commission meeting scheduled for Wednesday, December 14th at 10:30 a.m. in Austin. Details will be published on the agency website prior to the meeting. You can also do your Christmas shopping at the Capitol Gift Shop.
Yeah.
Oh, boy. We will also have another public meeting on rules review to be scheduled during the month of January 2023 with a specific place, date, and time to be determined. Yeah. This is going to be speak now or forever hold your peace. Thank you all for attending today's meeting. The time is now 1:11 p.m. All business concluded. We are now adjourned.
Thank you,
very much.
everyone.
Appreciate it.